Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On a cold morning in December of 1872, a Scottish-born ironmaster named Andrew Carnegie stood on a muddy hillside above the Monongahela River outside Pittsburgh, watching surveyors drive their stakes into frozen ground for what he had already, in his own private correspondence, begun calling the largest steel mill the world had ever seen, a mill he intended to name after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a man whose own goodwill Carnegie had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly and deliberately cultivating. And as he stood there in the mud that morning, a man who had arrived in America 25 years earlier as a penniless 12-year-old immigrant, the son of a Scottish handloom weaver, whose own trade had been destroyed by the very machines this whole story is about to describe, he was not thinking, by his own later account, about steel at all, but about a number, the number of tons a single furnace could theoretically produce in a single year, if every part of the process, or coming in, coke burning, pig iron pouring, steel rolling, could be made to run without a single wasted motion or a single wasted hour. A number he had copied down from a British engineering journal and carried folded in his own coat pocket for months. And it is worth sitting, honestly, with the specific scale of what that single obsessive number would eventually become, because the mill Carnegie broke ground for that December morning the Edgar Thomson Works would within 15 years be producing more steel in a single year than the entire United States had produced in any year before the Civil War. And the nation that Mill sat inside, a nation that had spent its own first 100 years as a marginal agricultural republic, scattered along the eastern edge of a continent, buying its own finished iron and its own manufactured cloth from British workshops, because it possessed almost no serious capacity to make either one itself, would within another 50 years be producing more steel, more oil, more coal, more finished manufactured goods of every conceivable kind than any other nation on the face of the earth. A transformation so complete and so rapid that a British visitor touring American steel mills in the 1890s, a respected engineer named James Bridge, wrote home that he had seen, within the space of a single generation, an entire industrial civilization built from nothing on ground that had been open pasture within living memory, and struggled, in his own considerable professional experience, to name anything in the whole of recorded human history that had happened quite this fast, at quite this scale, ever before. Tonight is not, at its own core, a story about any single furnace, or any single ironmaster standing on any single muddy hillside, however useful that image will prove for carrying us into everything that follows, because Andrew Carnegie's own obsessive arithmetic on that December morning in 1872 was only one small piece of a considerably larger engine that an entire nation had spent the better part of a century quietly assembling piece by piece, often without any clear sense of what the finished machine would eventually become. An engine built out of canals dug by hand through Appalachian rock, out of rail lines laid across a continent nobody had yet finished mapping, out of oil wells drilled into Pennsylvania hillsides by men who had no real idea what they were actually looking for, out of the labour of tens of millions of immigrants who crossed an ocean carrying almost nothing but their own 2 hands, and out of 2 devastating wars that forced a reluctant nation to discover, almost by accident, exactly how much it was actually capable of building when building stopped being optional. This is not a story about American industrial supremacy arriving as some kind of natural birthright, a version of events a great deal of later American memory has always found comfortable to tell, and it is not, either, a story about pure individual genius. However genuinely remarkable a handful of the men at its centre actually were, single-handedly willing an industrial civilization into being out of nothing but their own ambition. It is a story about an engine that had to be built before it could ever run, built out of coal and iron, and immigrant sweat and government land grants and war contracts and 100 separate decisions made by 100 separate people who mostly could not see, at the time they made them, how the pieces would eventually fit together. And it is, just as much, A story about who actually shoveled the coal into that same engine once it finally started running, the 12-year-old mill hands and the 14-hour shifts, and it had no significant reserves of investment capital. Its own banking system, still little more than a scattered handful of state-chartered institutions, nobody outside their own immediate region particularly trusted. It had no meaningful domestic manufacturing base to speak of. The overwhelming majority of finished goods, from woolen cloth to iron tools to fine furniture, still crossing the Atlantic from British workshops precisely as they had before the war, and it had, perhaps most tellingly of all, an economy built almost entirely around exporting raw agricultural commodities, tobacco, cotton, wheat and timber, and importing the finished manufactured products. Those raw commodities were turned into somewhere else, a pattern of trade that left the new republic in a position uncomfortably close to a colonial economy in everything but its own newly won political independence. It is worth naming the specific man who looked at this same discouraging picture in the early 1790s and concluded, against the fairly settled opinion of a considerable number of his own contemporaries, that it did not have to stay that way, because Alexander Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury under President Washington, submitted to Congress in December of 1791 a lengthy formal document titled The Report on the Subject of Manufactures, arguing with the same careful, exhaustive precision he had already brought to rescuing the new nation's war debt and establishing its first national bank, that a republic dependent on foreign nations for its own manufactured goods would remain, in any moment of real crisis, dangerously and permanently vulnerable, and that the federal government therefore had a legitimate and pressing interest in actively encouraging domestic manufacturing through protective tariffs on competing foreign imports, through targeted government subsidies for promising new industries, and through public investment in the roads and canals that would eventually let American manufacturers actually reach American markets scattered across an enormous and still largely roadless continent. Hamilton's own vision ran directly against the considerably more pastoral and considerably more widely shared vision of an agrarian republic that his great rival Thomas Jefferson had spent these same years championing. Jefferson arguing with real and consistent conviction that a nation of independent small farmers offered the only truly stable foundation for republican virtue, and that concentrated manufacturing, with its own crowded cities and its own dependent wage labourers, risked importing into America precisely the kind of corrupt, unequal society the European industrial cities Jefferson had personally toured seemed to him already to represent. A genuine philosophical disagreement about what kind of nation America actually wanted to become that would continue, in one form or another, to shape American economic argument for the whole of the following century. Sit with too exactly how little of Hamilton's own specific program Congress actually enacted in his own lifetime, because his proposed system of direct manufacturing subsidies died quickly in a Congress dominated by legislators who found the idea of government-picking industrial winners genuinely alarming, and it would take the shock of an entirely different and considerably more concrete crisis to finally persuade a sceptical Congress that Hamilton's underlying warning about foreign dependence had been worth taking seriously after all. That crisis arrived in the form of the War of 1812, when a British naval blockade of the American coast, imposed across the very same years the war itself was being fought, cut the United States off almost entirely from the British manufactured goods, textiles especially, that American households had continued relying on for the whole of the previous 3 decades. And American entrepreneurs, suddenly facing a domestic market starved of cloth and unable to import any more of it, discovered, in a scramble that would prove considerably more consequential than the war's own largely inconclusive battles, that building the manufacturing capacity to make that cloth domestically was not merely patriotic, but, for the first time in the young republic's history, also genuinely and reliably profitable. A river in Massachusetts that a Boston merchant turned into the first working model of everything this whole story eventually became. Notice plainly the specific man and the specific river where American manufacturing first proved, in a fully worked example, rather than a Treasury Secretary's report, that it could actually be done at real scale, because a wealthy Boston merchant named Francis Cabot Lowell travelled to England in 1810, ostensibly for his own health, and spent months touring British textile mills, memorising, since British law strictly forbade the export of textile machinery designs, or the emigration of skilled mechanics who understood them, the precise mechanical workings of the power looms he observed, carrying no drawings and no stolen blueprints back across the Atlantic with him at all, only a detailed working knowledge held entirely inside his own head, and returning to Massachusetts in 1812 to begin, together with a gifted mechanic named Paul Moody, the patient work of reconstructing an entire integrated cotton mill, a single building where raw cotton would enter at one end and finished cloth would emerge at the other, a genuine innovation that went considerably beyond anything British manufacturers themselves had yet fully achieved, since British textile production still generally divided spinning and weaving between separate specialised mills, rather than combining every stage of the process under one roof and one system of centralised power. Notice, too, the specific and genuinely striking labour system Lowell and his own business partners built around that same integrated mill once they moved its full operation to a new planned industrial town on the Merrimack River they named, after Lowell's own death in 1817, in his honour, because rather than recruiting the desperate, impoverished labour that filled British textile mills, the so-called Lowell system deliberately recruited young unmarried farm women from across rural New England, offering them supervised company boarding houses, a fixed and, by the standards of the day, genuinely respectable wage paid directly to the women themselves rather than to their own fathers, and a working environment the mill's own owners marketed with real success as a wholesome and temporary stepping stone rather than a permanent condition. A system that drew tens of thousands of young women into Lowell's own mills across the 1820s and 1830s, women who worked punishing 12 and 13-hour days tending looms in rooms so loud that workers developed their own private sign language to communicate over the noise, but who also, in their off hours, organised their own literary societies, published their own magazine called the Lowell Offering, and in 1834 and again in 1836 organised some of the earliest labour strikes in American history when mill owners attempted to cut their wages, marching out of the mills together and refusing to return until the cuts were at least partially reversed. A genuinely early demonstration that the same workers an industrialising economy depended on were also, from nearly the first working generation, capable of organising to push back against exactly the conditions that economy imposed on them. Trace, too, exactly how quickly the Lowell model spread once its own basic profitability had been demonstrated, because by the 1840s the Merrimack Valley alone hosted a string of similar planned mill towns, and cotton textile manufacturing had grown, within barely 3 decades of the War of 1812's own accidental push toward domestic production, into the young nation's single largest manufacturing industry, consuming, by the eve of the Civil War, well over half of all the raw cotton grown across the American South, a cotton grown, this evening would ask you to hold honestly rather than pass over, almost entirely by enslaved labour, so that the first genuinely large-scale American manufacturing industry sat, from its very own founding years, at the direct economic centre of a slave economy the industrialising North would eventually go to war against. A contradiction this evening we'll return to directly once we reach that same war. A gun that could be repaired with a spare part pulled at random from an entirely different identical gun, and the manufacturing idea that quietly made everything else in this whole story possible. Follow too one further and considerably less celebrated early American manufacturing innovation, running alongside Lowell's own integrated cotton mill, because a Connecticut inventor named Eli Whitney, already well known for having patented the cotton gin in 1793, a machine that had, in a genuinely bitter irony given his own later reputation as a manufacturing pioneer, made cotton cultivation so much more profitable that it directly entrenched and expanded American slavery across the following decades rather than reducing the demand for enslaved labour as Whitney himself had once hoped it might, secured a federal contract in 1798 to manufacture 10,000 muskets for the United States government, and promised Congress, in a famous and by most historical accounts considerably exaggerated demonstration staged in Washington in 1801, that he could produce muskets built from fully interchangeable parts, assembling several working firearms in front of sceptical government officials from a jumbled pile of components, each part machined precisely enough to fit any of the identical guns rather than being hand-fitted file by file to one specific weapon the way gunsmiths had always built firearms before. Trace, too, exactly how much of that same famous demonstration was genuine manufacturing achievement and how much was closer to theatre, because later historians examining Whitney's own surviving factory records have found that his actual production process in the early 1800s fell considerably short of the fully interchangeable ideal he had promised Congress, individual parts still requiring a fair amount of hand-fitting well into the 1820s, and that Whitney's own genuine and lasting contribution lay less in personally perfecting interchangeable manufacturing himself than in popularising, through that same well-publicised demonstration, the underlying idea that precision, standardisation, and specialised machine tools could eventually replace the individually hand-fitted craftsmanship every previous manufacturing tradition had relied on, an idea the federal government's own armories at Springfield, Massachusetts, and Harper's Ferry, Virginia, spent the following 4 decades patiently and considerably more rigorously turning into genuine industrial reality, developing the precision milling machines, the gauging systems, and the trained machinist workforce that finally achieved true interchangeable parts manufacturing by the 1840s, a system so distinctive that British industrial observers touring American arms factories at the London exhibition of 1851 coined the specific term the American system of manufactures to describe it, a manufacturing philosophy that would travel across the following 60 years from the Springfield Armory's own musket production directly into the Civil War rifle contracts this evening as already described, and from there, by a route running through sewing machine and bicycle and typewriter manufacturing, straight into the standardised, precisely machined interchangeable parts Henry Ford's own moving assembly line would eventually depend on completely. A canal dug by hand across 400 miles of forest, and the moment distance itself stopped being the young republic's single largest problem. We turn now to the specific physical obstacle that had done more than any tariff debate or any mill owner's ambition to keep the early United States from becoming anything resembling a unified industrial economy. Because a nation stretched along an eastern seaboard and pushing steadily westward across the Appalachian Mountains faced a problem considerably more basic than a shortage of capital or a shortage of skilled labour, the plain physical difficulty of actually moving goods any meaningful distance at all, since a wagon hauling freight overland in the early 1800s might cover, on a good road, perhaps 15 or 20 miles in a full day's travel, at a cost that could easily exceed the entire value of the goods themselves once they had travelled more than 100 miles from where they started, a friction of distance that kept the interior of the continent, however rich its own soil and however abundant its own timber and coal, functionally disconnected from the coastal markets and coastal capital an industrial economy would eventually require. Consider, too, the specific and genuinely audacious project New York State undertook to solve exactly that problem, because Governor DeWitt Clinton persuaded the state legislature in 1817 to fund, entirely with state money after the federal government under President Madison had declined to support it, a canal running 363 miles from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo on the shore of Lake Erie. A project so ambitious for its own era that critics derisively nicknamed it Clinton's Folly, cut almost entirely by hand and by simple horse-drawn scraper through forest and swamp and solid rock by a workforce of labourers, a considerable number of them Irish immigrants who would form the leading edge of a much larger wave still to come, engineered by men who had never built a canal of any kind before, and who worked out the necessary techniques for locks and aqueducts, largely through their own trial and error as the project advanced. the Erie Canal opened in full in 1825, and its own economic effect proved almost immediate and almost impossible to overstate, cutting the cost of shipping a ton of freight between Buffalo and New York City from something in the range of $100 by wagon to something closer to $10 by canal barge, and cutting the travel time from roughly 3 weeks to roughly 8 days, a transformation that redirected the entire flow of Western American agricultural trade away from the Mississippi River and New Orleans, and toward New York City instead, turning that single city, within a single working generation, into the undisputed commercial capital of the entire nation, and setting off a wave of canal-building fever across a dozen other states eager to replicate New York's own success, most of which, lacking New York's own favourable geography, would prove considerably less profitable, but that collectively knit the young nation's interior into its own coastal markets in a way that had simply not existed before. A rail line replacing a canal within the very same working lifetime, and the moment the young republic stopped measuring distance in weeks. Mark, though, exactly how quickly this same canal-building triumph was overtaken by an entirely different technology, because even as canal fever was still spreading across the 1830s, American engineers and American investors had already begun building an alternative that would, within barely 2 more decades, render the canal boom almost entirely obsolete. The steam-powered railroad, a British invention first proven commercially viable on the Stockton and Darlington line in England in 1825 and imported to American soil with remarkable speed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad breaking ground in 1828 as the first common carrier railroad chartered anywhere in the United States. And it is worth naming, honestly, exactly why the railroad so quickly displaced the canal. It had at first seemed merely to supplement, because a canal, however cheap once built, remained frozen and entirely unusable for a considerable portion of every northern winter, and could only ever run where the land's own elevation allowed water to be reasonably held and locked, while a railroad could run through winter, could climb grades. No canal could ever manage, and could, once track had actually been laid, move freight and passengers at speeds a canal barge, however efficient, could never hope to match. Mark II, exactly how fast American rail mileage actually grew across the 3 decades between that first Baltimore and Ohio groundbreaking and the outbreak of the Civil War, because the United States possessed scarcely 30 miles of operating railroad track in 1830, and possessed, by 1860, something in the range of 30,000 miles, more railroad track than the whole of Europe combined, a growth financed through a combination of private investment, state government bonds, and, increasingly across these same decades, direct grants of public land from a federal government eager to see the vast interior of the continent settled and connected, a pattern of public land subsidy that would reach its own most dramatic expression only after the Civil War itself, but that had already, by 1860, transformed the railroad from a genuinely experimental curiosity into the unquestioned backbone of American commerce, moving grain from Midwestern farms to eastern cities, moving coal from Appalachian mines to the iron furnaces and textile mills that depended on it, and moving, not incidentally, an increasing volume of the finished manufactured goods those same furnaces and mills were beginning to produce out to markets scattered across a rapidly growing nation. Watch, too, the specific and genuinely underappreciated way the railroad reorganized something considerably more basic than freight rates, because before the railroad's own rapid expansion forced the issue, American towns each kept their own local solar time, a practice that left thousands of slightly different local times in simultaneous use across the country, and that caused, as railroad schedules grew more complex and more interdependent, an escalating and genuinely dangerous series of scheduling confusions and outright train collisions, until the major American railroad companies, acting entirely on their own private industry authority, rather than waiting for any act of Congress, agreed among themselves in 1883 to divide the country into 4 standard time zones, the system towns and cities across the nation, adopted almost overnight in practical deference to the railroad schedules their own daily lives now depended on, decades before the federal government itself formally codified the same time zones into law, a small but genuinely striking example of exactly how completely the railroad had already reorganized the practical texture of American daily life well before most Americans had ever consciously registered that a single private industry had just redrawn the clock on their own kitchen wall. A war that both nations expected to win quickly, and the industrial arithmetic neither side had fully reckoned with. This brings us to the specific and genuinely brutal test that would, within a single 4-year span, reveal exactly how far this whole, slow accumulation of canals and railroads and textile mills and iron furnaces had actually carried the northern half of the country, and exactly how far behind the southern half had, by comparison, been left. Because when the Civil War began in April of 1861, the 11 states that would form the Confederacy possessed, by the most careful modern economic accounting, something in the range of 1/10 of the nation's manufacturing capacity, a considerably smaller share of its railroad mileage, and almost none of its capacity to produce iron, coal, or finished firearms at any scale, approaching what a modern war would actually require. An imbalance Southern political leaders themselves were not entirely blind to, but that a great many of them believed at the war's own outset would matter considerably less than it eventually did, trusting instead in the Confederacy's own control of the cotton the textile mills of Britain and the North depended on, and in a belief, widely shared among Southern leaders in the spring of 1861, that the war itself would prove short. Watch, too, exactly what 4 years of sustained industrial-scale war actually did to the northern economy that had to fight it, because the Union's own need to arm, clothe, feed, and transport an army that would eventually number over 2 million men across the course of the war forced an already considerable northern manufacturing base to expand at a pace and a scale it had never previously attempted. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and a network of private contractors producing rifled muskets by the hundreds of thousands using increasingly standardized, interchangeable parts, northern textile mills temporarily cut off from southern cotton by the Union's own naval blockade, shifting a considerable share of their own capacity to producing woolen uniforms instead, and northern railroads, coordinated for the first time under something approaching genuinely centralized wartime direction, moving troops and supplies at a scale and a speed no army in human history had previously managed, so that by the war's own final years the Union was fielding, supplying, and sustaining an industrialized fighting force the Confederacy, for all the genuine tactical skill of its own generals, simply could not match on anything resembling equal material terms. It is hard not to notice, too, the specific and genuinely consequential piece of financial innovation the war itself forced into being, because the Union's own government, facing a scale of wartime expenditure far beyond what existing tax revenue or existing borrowing capacity could readily cover, turned to a Philadelphia financier named J. Cook, who developed and pioneered techniques for selling government war bonds directly to ordinary citizens in small denominations through an extensive, deliberately democratized sales network of local agents, rather than relying solely on the handful of large private banking houses that had traditionally handled government finance, raising, across the course of the war, well over $1 billion in bond sales from hundreds of thousands of individual American households, an innovation that both financed the Union war effort and, in the process, created a considerably broader and considerably more financially literate investing public than had existed before the war, a public that would, in the following decades, prove an essential and ready source of the enormous quantities of private capital the post-war industrial boom this whole story is building toward would soon require. The same financier who had taught America how to buy its own war, brought down within a single autumn afternoon by a railroad he had overextended himself building. Weigh, too, the specific and genuinely bitter postscript to J. Cook's own wartime triumph, because Cook's own banking house, flush with the reputation and the capital its wartime bond sales had built, moved heavily across the following years into financing the construction of the Northern Pacific Railroad, a considerably riskier venture than selling government-guaranteed war bonds had ever been. And when the Northern Pacific's own construction costs ran far beyond what the railroad's still sparse settler traffic could support, Cook's firm collapsed entirely on the 18th of September, 1873, a single failure prominent enough to trigger a genuine national panic, the New York Stock Exchange closing its own doors for 10 consecutive days, the longest closure in its history up to that point, and setting off a depression that lasted, by most careful economic reconstructions, the better part of 5 full years, tens of thousands of businesses failing and unemployment among urban industrial workers climbing, in the Depression's own worst cities, to something in the range of 1 in 4. And it is worth naming honestly that this same pattern, a railroad boom financed on credit that ran well ahead of the actual traffic and the actual revenue the new lines could support, collapsing into a sudden and genuinely brutal panic, repeated itself again in 1893, when the failure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad set off a second depression that would still be weighing on the American economy when George Pullman cut his own workers' wages the following year, so that the boom this whole evening has spent so long celebrating never actually ran in one smooth, uninterrupted line at all, but lurched forward across these same decades through a genuinely painful and genuinely repeated cycle of overbuilding, panic and slow recovery that a listener drifting through only the century's own final production numbers would have no particular reason to ever suspect had happened at all. A Congress that used the distraction of a civil war to finally pass the very laws Hamilton had failed to win 70 years earlier. Examine plainly the specific and genuinely consequential legislative window the Civil War quietly opened, because with the southern states and their own long-dominant free trade, anti-tariff, anti-subsidy congressional bloc entirely absent from Washington, for the first time in the nation's history, a Republican-controlled Congress moved rapidly across 1861 and 1862 to pass a cluster of laws that amounted, in combination, to very nearly the full program Alexander Hamilton had failed to win 7 decades earlier. A series of protective tariffs raising duties on competing foreign manufactured goods to levels not seen since the young republic's earliest years. A Homestead Act offering 160 acres of federal land free to any settler willing to work it for 5 years, opening the western interior to a wave of agricultural settlement that would, in turn, create new markets for eastern manufactured goods and new sources of raw grain and livestock for eastern cities, and, in a piece of legislation that would shape the following half-century of American industrial geography, more directly than perhaps any other single law this whole story is going to describe, the Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864, authorizing and directly subsidizing, through enormous grants of federal land and federally guaranteed bonds, the construction of a transcontinental railroad line that would finally connect the settled eastern half of the continent to the Pacific coast. 2 companies racing toward each other across a continent paid by the mile, and the workforce history nearly managed to erase. Take note plainly of exactly how that same transcontinental railroad was actually built, because Congress chartered 2 separate private companies to build it, the Union Pacific Building westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific Building eastward from Sacramento, California, each company receiving federal land grants and federal bonds calculated per mile of track actually completed, an arrangement that gave both companies a powerful and, as it would later turn out, genuinely corrupting incentive to build as many miles as quickly as possible, with as little regard for the terrain's own actual difficulty as they could manage, the Union Pacific in particular becoming entangled, in a scandal that would not fully surface until several years after the line's own completion, in a scheme called Credit Mobilier, through which company insiders funneled construction contracts to a shell company they themselves owned, systematically overbilling the federal government for work performed and quietly distributing shares of the resulting profit to sympathetic members of Congress to keep the whole arrangement from facing any serious official scrutiny. Picture, too, the specific and genuinely brutal work of actually laying that same track, because the Union Pacific's own construction crews, working across the relatively flat plains of Nebraska and Wyoming, drew heavily on Irish immigrant labour and on veterans of the just concluded Civil War from both the Union and Confederate armies, men who laid track at a punishing pace through country still contested, at real and violent cost to native nations whose own land the line was being built directly across, while the Central Pacific, facing the considerably more brutal engineering challenge of the Sierra Nevada mountains, turned, after white labourers proved difficult to recruit and retain for work, the company's own foremen considered too dangerous and too poorly compensated, to Chinese immigrant labour, recruiting first from among Chinese communities already established in California from the earlier gold rush years, and then directly from villages in China's own Guangdong province, so that by the peak of construction in the late 1860s, something in the range of 12,000 Chinese labourers, the overwhelming majority of the entire Central Pacific workforce, were blasting tunnels through solid granite with black powder, and, in the project's own final and most dangerous phase, with the recently invented and considerably more volatile nitroglycerin, suspending workers in hand-woven baskets over sheer cliff faces to place explosive charges, and building, across the winter of 1866 and 1867, an entire functioning railroad camp inside snow tunnels dug beneath drifts that in places exceeded 40 feet in depth. Remember, honestly, exactly how these same Chinese workers were actually treated and actually compensated for work that killed, by even the most conservative later estimates, several hundred of them, and quite possibly close to 1,000, avalanche, explosion, tunnel collapse, and disease claiming lives at a rate the company's own official records almost never bothered to carefully track, because Chinese labourers were paid considerably less than white labourers doing comparable work, were required, unlike their white counterparts, to provide their own food and their own tents out of their own already reduced wages, and organised, in June of 1867, one of the largest labour strikes in the American West up to that point, some 3,000 Chinese workers laying down their tools simultaneously to demand wages equal to white labourers and a shorter working day, a strike the Central Pacific's own leadership broke within roughly a week by cutting off the strikers' own food supply in the isolated mountain camps where they had no other source of provisions, a coercion that succeeded in ending the strike without conceding the workers' own core demands. And it is hard not to notice, finally, exactly who was and was not included when the two lines finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah, on the 10th of May, 1869, because the famous photograph taken that day of company officials and workers gathered around the ceremonial golden final spike shows almost no Chinese faces at all, despite Chinese labourers having built the overwhelming majority of the Central Pacific's own most difficult and most dangerous mileage, an erasure historians have only in recent decades begun systematically correcting through census records, company payroll ledgers, and the oral histories preserved within Chinese American communities themselves, an engine finely connected end to end, and the specific arithmetic that turned connection into a genuinely national market. Look, too, closely at exactly what completing that same transcontinental connection actually did to the practical texture of American commerce, because a journey that had previously required months by wagon train, or a genuinely dangerous sea voyage around the tip of South America, now took under a week by rail, and the completed national rail network, which stood at roughly 30,000 miles at the outbreak of the Civil War, grew across the following 3 decades to something in the range of 160,000 miles by 1890, more than the rest of the entire world's railroad mileage combined, a network dense enough and reliable enough that, for the first time in American history, a manufacturer in Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Chicago could reasonably plan to sell finished goods in a genuinely national market rather than a purely regional one, and a farmer in Kansas or Nebraska could reasonably plan to ship raw grain to processing mills and export docks 1,000 miles away. An integration of what had been, before the railroad's own full completion, a loose patchwork of largely separate regional economies into something that finally deserved to be called, for the first time, a single national market, the essential precondition, this evening would suggest for everything still to come. A poor Scottish weaver's son who learned, as a boy running messages inside a telegraph office, exactly how information itself could be turned into money. It is worth returning now to the muddy Pittsburgh hillside this evening opened upon, because Andrew Carnegie's own path to that hillside had run through nearly every one of the industries this evening has already described, and understanding that path is the clearest way into understanding how post-war American steel production actually grew as fast as it did. Carnegie arrived in the United States in 1848 as a penniless 12-year-old, his own family driven out of Scotland after mechanised power looms destroyed the hand-loom weaving trade his father had practised for his entire working life, a personal history that left the adult Carnegie, by his own account, with a lifelong and genuinely complicated relationship to the very machines that had ruined his own father, and that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men who had ever lived. Young Carnegie worked first as a bobbin boy in a Pittsburgh cotton mill, then as a telegraph messenger, teaching himself Morse code well enough to work the telegraph key directly, a skill that brought him to the attention of Thomas Scott, a senior official of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who hired the teenage Carnegie as his own personal secretary and telegraph operator, and who taught him, across the following decade of steady promotion through the railroad's own management ranks, the 2 lessons Carnegie would later credit as the true foundation of his entire fortune: that a business's own precise granular cost accounting mattered more than almost anything else in determining whether it would ultimately turn a profit, and that cultivating the goodwill and the confidence of powerful men considerably richer than himself was worth more, in the long run, than any single transaction. Way 2, exactly how Carnegie actually built his own initial fortune before he ever entered the steel business at all, because across the 1860s, still formally employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carnegie began investing, first with borrowed money and then with the returns those first investments generated in iron bridge manufacturing, in oil wells in western Pennsylvania during the earliest years of the American oil boom this evening will return to shortly, and in the Pullman Palace Car Company's own predecessor, sleeping car manufacturing, accumulating by the early 1870s a personal fortune already considerable enough that he did not, strictly speaking, need to build the largest steel mill in the world at all, and it is worth naming, honestly, that Carnegie's own decision to commit himself so completely to steel came only after a visit to England in 1872, where he toured the works of Henry Bessemer, the British inventor whose own patented process for blowing air through molten iron to burn off its impurities had, over the preceding 15 years, made it possible to produce steel, a metal stronger and more useful than iron, but historically far too expensive to produce in any bulk quantity, at a fraction of its former cost and at an entirely new industrial scale. And Carnegie returned from that same visit convinced, with the same absolute conviction that had already made him rich twice over in other industries, that steel, not iron, would build the next American century, and that whoever mastered the Bessemer process most completely and most ruthlessly would own the resulting industry outright. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely distinctive business philosophy Carnegie built around that same conviction, because rather than simply building one more steel mill among many, Carnegie pursued, across the 15 years following the Edgar Thompson Works' own opening, a strategy of what business historians would come to call vertical integration, acquiring not just additional steel mills but the iron ore mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range that supplied his own furnaces' raw ore, the coal mines and coking ovens that supplied the fuel those furnaces burned, the fleet of Great Lakes freighters, and the rail lines that moved ore and coal and finished steel between them, so that by the 1890s the Carnegie Steel Company controlled, at every single stage between raw ore in the ground and finished steel rail leaving the mill, a process no competitor who still had to purchase ore or coal or transportation on the open market could realistically match on cost, a relentless obsession with driving down cost per ton that Carnegie pursued with a single-mindedness that became, among his own workforce, something considerably closer to legend than mere business strategy, tearing down and rebuilding brand new, still profitable mills the moment a genuinely more efficient design became available, rather than accepting even a marginally suboptimal process simply because the existing equipment still technically worked. Consider, too, exactly what that same relentless cost-cutting actually meant for the men who worked inside Carnegie's own mills, because the same Andrew Carnegie who wrote, in a widely read essay published in 1889 entitled The Gospel of Wealth, that the rich held their own fortunes in a kind of moral trust for the broader public good, and who would go on to give away, across the final decades of his own life, well over $300 million to fund public libraries, universities and concert halls across the English-speaking world, also presided, across these same decades, over mills where the standard working shift ran 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a single 24-hour shift every other week when day and night crews rotated, where workers laboured beside open furnaces radiating heat that could exceed 130 degrees, and where a study conducted in the early 1900s by the Federal Bureau of Labour found that roughly 1 in 5 men working in the steel industry could expect to be killed or seriously injured on the job across the course of an average working career, a gap between Carnegie's own carefully cultivated public philosophy of stewardship and the actual daily reality inside his own mills that this evening would ask you to hold rather than resolve, because it recurs, in one form or another, across nearly every industry this whole story is going to describe. A strike at the very mill Carnegie had built his own reputation on, fought while its own owner was safely on vacation an ocean away. Notice plainly the specific and genuinely violent confrontation that exposed that same gap most starkly, because in the summer of 1892, with Carnegie himself vacationing at his own castle in Scotland, and having left the day-to-day management of his own company's largest mill, the Homestead Works outside Pittsburgh, in the hands of his own chairman, a hard-driving executive named Henry Clay Frick, the company moved to cut wages for the mill's own skilled workers, a considerable share of them organised into one of the strongest craft unions in the country, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and to let the union's own existing contract with the company lapse entirely, a move Frick pursued with the explicit private intention, confirmed in his own later correspondence, of breaking the union's presence at Homestead permanently, rather than merely negotiating a lower wage. When the union's own membership rejected the company's final offer, and Frick responded by locking the entire workforce out of the mill and surrounding it with the newly built fence workers themselves nicknamed Fort Frick, the confrontation escalated on the 6th of July, 1892, into open armed conflict when Frick attempted to bring in 300 armed guards from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency by barge along the Monongahela River to retake and reopen the mill under strikebreaker labour, and locked out workers and their own supporters, having anticipated exactly this move, met the barges at the riverbank with rifle fire, and a battle that stretched across most of a single day, involving gunfire, dynamite, and even an improvised cannon the workers themselves had rigged, left 3 Pinkerton guards and 7 workers dead before the Pinkertons, trapped and outnumbered, finally surrendered and were marched under a hail of abuse and physical blows from an enraged crowd out of the town. Take note too of exactly how the confrontation was ultimately resolved, because the Pennsylvania governor, at Frick's own urgent request, dispatched roughly 8,000 state militia troops to occupy Homestead and reopen the mill under armed protection barely a week after the battle on the river, allowing Frick to bring in non-union replacement labour and effectively breaking the strike within a matter of months, a defeat compounded in a genuinely strange twist that briefly reversed public sympathy back toward the company, when a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman, acting entirely on his own initiative and without the striker's own knowledge or approval, forced his way into Frick's own office at the end of July and shot and stabbed him in a failed assassination attempt, an act of individual political violence that let Frick, recovering from wounds he would fully survive, cast the entire labour movement in the newspapers as inherently dangerous and un-American, and it is worth naming, honestly, exactly what the strike's own final collapse meant for organised labour across the whole of the American steel industry, because the Amalgamated Association, which had represented roughly a quarter of Carnegie's own steelworkers before the Homestead strike, would not regain any meaningful organised presence inside a major American steel mill for close to another 40 years. A single defeat at a single mill that set the terms for close to 2 generations of just how completely American steel's own enormous productivity gains would arrive largely on management's own terms, rather than through any genuine bargaining with the workers who actually produced them. Trace, finally, the specific and genuinely telling way Carnegie himself responded from an ocean away once news of the violence at Homestead reached him in Scotland, because Carnegie, who had spent years cultivating a public reputation as a friend of labour, who had written, only a few years earlier, that a private capitalist had no more right to reduce a workman's wage without his own consent than that same workman had to invade the capitalist's own office, sent Frick a private telegram of full support before the violence had even fully ended, and later, in his own considerably more polished public statements once the dust had settled, distanced himself from the worst of the bloodshed while never once repudiating Frick's own underlying strategy or offering to restore the union presence the strike had permanently broken. A pattern of public philanthropy paired with private industrial ruthlessness that a great many of Carnegie's own contemporaries and a great many historians since have found difficult to fully reconcile, and that this evening would simply ask you to notice rather than judge on its own. Because judging it fully is a task this whole night still has a great deal further to travel before it can properly attempt. An industry that kept growing, whatever the human cost, until an entire nation's steel output could be measured only against itself. Follow too exactly what all of this relentless consolidation and this relentless labour discipline actually produced in raw output. Because American steel production, which stood at scarcely 77,000 tonnes in 1870, the year before Carnegie broke ground on the Edgar Thomson Works, grew to over 10 million tonnes by 1900 and to over 28 million tonnes by 1913, overtaking British steel production entirely by the mid-1890s and overtaking the combined steel output of Britain, Germany and France together within another 2 decades. A compounding growth curve that transformed the United States within the space of a single working lifetime, from a nation that had imported the majority of its own finished steel rail at the start of Carnegie's own career into the single largest steel producer on the face of the earth by the time he finally sold his company and retired from business altogether. A building race conducted almost entirely in secret between 2 rival architects, each convinced the other was about to steal the title of world's tallest building out from under him. Mark, briefly, exactly what all of this newly abundant and newly affordable steel actually let American cities physically become, because the same steel frame construction technique pioneered in Chicago in the 1880s, replacing the load-bearing masonry walls that had limited buildings to perhaps 10 or 12 stories for the whole of human architectural history, with an internal steel skeleton capable of supporting considerably taller structures on a comparatively small footprint, combined with Elisha Otis's earlier invention of a genuinely safe passenger elevator to make the skyscraper physically possible for the first time, and New York City's own skyline across the boom years of the 1920s became the site of a genuinely theatrical competition between rival developers, each racing in considerable secrecy to complete the world's tallest building. The architect of 40 Wall Street quietly adding a final spire at the last possible moment specifically to edge out the Chrysler Building's own announced height, only for the Chrysler Building's own architect, who had anticipated exactly this kind of last-minute manoeuvre, to unveil a hidden steel spire of his own, secretly assembled inside the building's own crown and raised into place in under 2 hours, that pushed his own tower past its rival by a wide and, for a brief while, unbeatable margin, a record the Chrysler Building held for less than a year before the Empire State Building, built astonishingly fast, structural steel framing rising at a pace of roughly 4.5 stories a week, across a mere 13 months of construction, surpassed it decisively, a single vertical mile of combined new construction that stood, examined honestly, as a genuinely direct architectural expression of exactly how cheap and exactly how abundant Carnegie's and Morgan's own steel had actually become within the span of a single working lifetime. A single lunch, a single handshake, and the first company in human history worth $1 billion. Watch, plainly, exactly how Carnegie's own career in steel actually ended, because in the closing weeks of 1899 and the opening weeks of 1900, the financier J. Pierpont Morgan, already the most powerful private banker in the entire country, and the man who had personally reorganized and stabilized a considerable share of the nation's own railroad industry across the preceding 2 decades, began quietly assembling a plan to merge Carnegie Steel together, with a dozen of its own largest remaining competitors, into a single unified corporation, and sent an intermediary, the steel executive Charles Schwab, to sound out whether Carnegie, by this point in his mid-60s, and increasingly inclined toward the philanthropic retirement his own Gospel of Wealth essay had long argued rich men owed the world, might actually be willing to sell. Carnegie, by his own later account, retreated to a private room, scribbled a asking price on a slip of paper without any extended negotiation at all, and handed it to Schwab, a figure of roughly $480 million, and when Morgan received the slip and read the number, he reportedly said only that he accepted, shaking Carnegie's own hand only once, some weeks later, and remarking, with what several witnesses described as genuine and considerable respect, that Carnegie ought to consider himself the richest man in the entire world, a sale that made Carnegie personally the wealthiest private individual on earth almost overnight, and that allowed Morgan, combining Carnegie Steel with the other companies he had already assembled, to incorporate in 1901 the United States Steel Corporation, capitalized at just over $1.4 billion, the first corporation in the whole of recorded human history ever to be valued at a full $1 billion, a single company that controlled, at the moment of its own founding, something in the range of 2/3 of the entire nation's steel-making capacity, a concentration of industrial power inside one boardroom that would, within less than a decade, help provoke exactly the kind of federal antitrust reckoning this evening will return to in its own proper turn, a well nobody understood, drilled by men who had no real idea what they were actually looking for. From here, the story moves to a second raw material, every bit as consequential to the engine this whole evening has been describing as coal and iron ever were. Because in August of 1859, a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake, hired by a group of investors who had grown curious about reports of oil seeping naturally to the surface near Titusville, Pennsylvania, succeeded, after months of frustrating and repeatedly collapsing attempts, in drilling the first commercially successful oil well in American history, striking oil at a depth of just under 70 feet and touching off, almost overnight, a chaotic regional boom that drew thousands of speculators and drillers into the hills of western Pennsylvania with no established science of petroleum geology to guide them at all. Wells drilled essentially at random on any land where surface seepage or simple, hopeful guesswork suggested oil might lie beneath. A boom considerably less organised and considerably more wasteful in its earliest years than almost anything else this whole story has yet described. Remember too exactly what a young Cleveland bookkeeper named John D. Rockefeller saw in that same chaotic and wasteful boom that a great many of the speculators drilling the wells themselves apparently did not, because Rockefeller, already a successful produce commission merchant in his mid-20s, recognised, with the same kind of careful, unglamorous accounting instinct Carnegie had learned at the Pennsylvania Railroad, that the genuine long-term fortune in the oil business lay not in the speculative and inherently unpredictable business of drilling wells at all, but in the considerably less romantic and considerably more controllable business of refining crude oil into kerosene. The product that, in an era before the widespread electric lighting this evening's own later hours will eventually describe, was rapidly displacing whale oil as the dominant fuel for household lighting across the entire country, and Rockefeller built, together with a small group of partners, a Cleveland refinery in 1863, and pursued, across the following decade, the exact same relentless granular cost accounting that would later define Carnegie's own approach to steel, tracking the cost of every single barrel, every single wooden shipping container, every single gallon of the sulfuric acid the refining process required, down to fractions of a cent, and systematically eliminating any waste or inefficiency his own meticulous ledgers happened to reveal. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely ruthless method Rockefeller actually used to grow his own single Cleveland refinery into the company that would eventually control the overwhelming majority of the entire nation's oil refining capacity, because Rockefeller organised his own growing collection of refineries in 1870 into the Standard Oil Company, and pursued, across the following 2 decades, a strategy of eliminating competition that ran considerably further than Carnegie's own vertical integration in steel ever did, negotiating secret preferential freight rate rebates from railroad companies desperate for Standard Oil's own enormous and reliable shipping volume, rebates that let Standard Oil ship its own product at costs smaller refiners simply could not match, and then approaching those same smaller, financially cornered competitors with a stark and carefully calculated choice: sell out to Standard Oil at a price Rockefeller himself considered fair, or face a company that could, and repeatedly did, undersell them in their own local markets until they went bankrupt on their own, and lost even the option of selling out at all. A campaign so effective that within Standard Oil's own internal corporate culture, it came to be known, without any apparent irony, simply as the plan, and that allowed Rockefeller's company to control, by the mid-1880s, something in the range of 90% of all oil refining capacity in the entire United States. Look, too, closely at the specific legal innovation Rockefeller's own lawyers devised in 1882 to hold this same sprawling empire of dozens of formerly separate companies together under one unified central direction, because existing American corporate law generally forbade one corporation from simply owning the stock of another corporation chartered in a different state, a legal patchwork that had, until that point, made it awkward for Standard Oil to exercise fully unified control over its own many constituent refineries scattered across multiple states, and Rockefeller's attorneys resolved the problem by creating the Standard Oil Trust, a legal arrangement in which the individual shareholders of dozens of formerly separate Standard Oil companies transferred their own shares to a small board of trustees, receiving in exchange trust certificates representing their own proportional interest in the combined whole, a structure that let Rockefeller's own inner circle exercise complete unified control over the entire sprawling operation, while each individual company remained, on paper, formally independent, an innovation so successful and so widely imitated by other industries seeking the same kind of unified control across multiple states that the word trust itself, within barely a decade, had become the standard American term for exactly the kind of concentrated corporate monopoly. This whole story's later hours are going to describe a rising progressive political movement organising specifically to break apart. A journalist whose own father had been ruined by exactly the tactic she spent years quietly documenting. Way, plainly, the specific investigation that did more than any single government action to turn American public opinion decisively against Standard Oil, because a journalist named Ida Tarbell, whose own father had run a small oil business in the very same Pennsylvania oil region Standard Oil had spent decades consolidating, and whose own family's modest prosperity had been directly damaged by exactly the freight rebate and undercutting tactics this evening, has already described, spent nearly 5 years, beginning in 1902, methodically researching Standard Oil's own history for a serialized investigation published in McClure's magazine, tracking down former Standard Oil employees willing to speak on the record, poring over thousands of pages of court records and legislative testimony from earlier state-level investigations, and interviewing Rockefeller's own surviving early business partners, producing a 19-part series later collected into a book that laid out with documentary precision and a restraint her own critics grudgingly admitted was considerably more damaging than outright polemic would have been, exactly how Standard Oil had actually built and maintained its own near-total monopoly. And it is worth naming too that Tarbell herself insisted, across her own long subsequent career, that she had never set out merely to settle a personal grievance on her own father's behalf, but that the family history had given her, by her own account, an unusually clear-eyed understanding of exactly what questions to actually ask. Examine finally exactly how this same public reckoning ended, because the federal government, acting under the Sherman Antitrust Act this evening, will return to in fuller context shortly, filed suit against Standard Oil in 1906, and the Supreme Court ruled, in May of 1911, that Standard Oil constituted an illegal monopoly and restraint of trade, and ordered the company broken apart into 34 separate and genuinely independent companies, several of which, renamed and restructured across the following century, would go on to become some of the largest oil companies in the entire world in their own right. And it is worth naming the genuinely striking financial irony that followed, because the combined value of the 34 newly independent companies' own stock, once investors could finally see and separately value each piece of the former monopoly on its own individual merits, rose so sharply in the months immediately following the breakup that Rockefeller himself, who had by this point in his mid-70s already retired from active management and turned the bulk of his own energy toward the same kind of large-scale philanthropy Carnegie had pursued, ended up considerably wealthier after the government ordered dissolution of his own company than he had been the day before it was broken apart. A single company's rise, consolidation, and forced dissolution that traces in miniature very nearly the entire arc this whole night is trying to walk you through. A well that blew so violently the first time it struck oil that it took 9 full days for the crew standing nearby to bring it back under any kind of control at all. Take note, too, of the specific discovery that shifted the centre of American oil production entirely away from the Pennsylvania hills, where Edwin Drake had first drilled, because a wildcat drilling crew working a low-salt dome hill near Beaumont, Texas, called Spindletop, struck oil on the 10th of January 1901 in a gusher that blew drilling pipe and mud hundreds of feet into the air, and that flowed, once finally capped, at a rate exceeding anything any single well in Pennsylvania had ever produced. A single Texas well, matching, within its own first few days, roughly half of the entire rest of the country's total daily oil output combined. And Spindletop's own discovery touched off a genuine Texas oil rush. hundreds of wells drilled across the surrounding hill within a matter of months, and gave rise, almost overnight, to several of the companies that would go on to dominate American and eventually global oil production for the whole of the following century, Texaco and Gulf Oil chief among them, companies whose own founding, unlike Rockefeller's own patient decades of refinery consolidation, traced back to a single explosive afternoon of pure geological luck. Sit with, too, exactly how directly this same shift toward Texas and, in the following decades, Oklahoma oil production fed the automobile boom this evening as already described, because American oil production, which had struggled to keep pace with rising kerosene demand across the 1890s, expanded so dramatically across the following 3 decades that gasoline, originally treated by refiners as a largely useless and mildly hazardous byproduct of kerosene production, became, almost overnight, once Ford's own Model T and its imitators put millions of internal combustion engines onto American roads, the single most valuable product to come out of any barrel of crude American oil output, climbing from under 100 million barrels a year at the time of the Spindletop strike to over 1 billion barrels a year by 1929. And it was this same enormous and rapidly expanding domestic oil supply, considerably larger and considerably more secure than anything Germany or Japan would possess a generation later, that let American tanks, ships and aircraft run across the whole of the Second World War this evening, we'll describe shortly, without ever once facing the genuine fuel shortages that helped cripple both of those rival wartime industrial machines. A workshop in New Jersey that its own owner deliberately called an invention factory, and the specific product that would end up mattering more than any single patent to come out of it. It is worth turning now to a third, and in some ways even more transformative technology running alongside the steel and the oil this evening as already described, because Thomas Edison, who had already made a considerable fortune improving the telegraph and inventing the phonograph, opened in 1876 a dedicated research and development laboratory at Menlo Park, New Jersey, staffed with a small permanent team of machinists and engineers, rather than working, as most inventors of the period still did, largely alone. A genuinely novel organisational model Edison himself described as an invention factory, promising, with characteristic and only slightly exaggerated confidence, a minor invention every 10 days and a major one every 6 months. And it was this same organised laboratory that produced in 1879 a commercially practical incandescent light bulb, not the first such bulb ever built, since other inventors in Britain and elsewhere had produced working prototypes years earlier, but the first genuinely durable and genuinely commercially viable version, burning for many hours rather than mere minutes, that Edison could actually build an entire electrical system around. Consider too exactly what building that same system actually required, because a light bulb by itself was merely a curiosity, unless an entire supporting infrastructure existed to power it, and Edison spent the following 3 years designing and building generators, underground cable networks, and household wiring standards from essentially nothing. Opening in September of 1882, the Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, the first commercial central power plant in the United States, supplying direct current electricity to a few hundred nearby customers across a service area of roughly 1 square mile, a genuinely small beginning that nonetheless proved for the first time anywhere in the country that electric lighting could be centrally generated and reliably delivered to paying customers at a scale beyond a single wealthy household's own private generator. A war fought not with soldiers but with 2 competing kinds of electrical current, and a travelling circus of electrocuted animals meant to win it. Remember, plainly, the specific and genuinely strange business rivalry that determined which particular version of this same new technology would actually come to power the country, because Edison's own direct current system suffered from a serious practical limitation: the inability to transmit electricity efficiently across distances greater than roughly a mile without unacceptable power loss, a limitation a rival inventor and manufacturer named George Westinghouse believed alternating current, which could be transformed to very high voltages for efficient long-distance transmission, and then stepped back down for safe household use, could solve decisively. And Westinghouse, working with the Serbian-born engineer Nikola Tesla, who had briefly worked for Edison himself before the two men parted ways over a bitter dispute regarding an unpaid bonus, developed and began commercially deploying alternating current systems across the late 1880s, a direct threat to Edison's own considerable financial stake in direct current technology that Edison met not merely with competing engineering, but with a deliberate and genuinely calculated public relations campaign designed to brand alternating current as lethally dangerous, funding public demonstrations in which Edison's own employees electrocuted stray dogs, and, on at least one well-documented occasion, a circus elephant named Topsy, using alternating currents specifically to produce a dramatic and widely publicised death, and quietly lobbying the state of New York to adopt alternating current, rather than the traditional hanging, as the method for the state's own newly authorised electric chair, hoping the public would come to associate the Westinghouse name itself with a mechanism of execution, a campaign that succeeded in generating considerable public anxiety, but that ultimately failed to stop alternating current's own underlying technical advantages from winning out, Westinghouse's own system securing the contract to harness Niagara Falls for large-scale electrical power generation in 1893. A project that proved, decisively and at genuinely enormous scale, that alternating current could deliver electricity reliably across considerably greater distances than direct current ever could, traced too exactly how quickly and how completely electrification actually spread across American industry once this same current war had settled itself, because the same financier who had assembled United States Steel, J. Pierpont Morgan, had backed Edison's own company from its own earliest years and helped engineer, in 1892, its merger with a rival electrical manufacturer into the General Electric Company, one of the original 12 companies listed on the newly created Dow Jones Industrial Average, and remarkably the only one of those original 12 still operating under its own original name well over a century later, and electric motors, replacing the steam engines and the elaborate belt and pulley systems that had powered nearly every American factory for the whole of the preceding century, spread across American industry with striking speed across the first 2 decades of the 20th century, American manufacturing establishments drawing something in the range of 2% of their own total power from electric motors in 1900 and close to 80% by 1930, a shift that let factory owners redesign their own production floors around the logic of the process itself, rather than around the physical constraints of a single central steam engine and its own network of overhead belts, an unglamorous but genuinely essential precondition for the kind of continuous moving assembly line Henry Ford would soon build at Highland Park. Look, too, closely at exactly how unevenly this same electrification actually reached the whole of the country, because while American cities electrified rapidly across the 1910s and 20s, something in the range of 90% of American farms still had no access to electric power at all as late as 1935, private power companies having generally judged the cost of running lines out to sparsely populated rural areas not worth the modest revenue those same lines would generate, a gap the federal government moved to close directly through the Rural Electrification Administration, created in 1935 as part of the same New Deal this evening, as already described, extending low-interest federal loans to farmer-owned electric cooperatives that private companies had declined to serve, so that the share of American farms with electric power climbed from roughly 10% in 1935 to over 90% by the early 1950s, one further quiet but genuinely consequential piece of federal intervention completing decades after the original current war had been settled in the cities, the electrification of the whole of the country rather than merely its own already profitable urban centres. A voice carried across a continent for the first time, and the specific single sentence its own inventor chose to say first. It is worth naming, briefly, one further communications technology running alongside the electric light and the moving assembly line, because Alexander Graham Bell, who had patented the telephone in 1876, lived long enough to personally inaugurate the first transcontinental telephone line in 1915, speaking from New York to his own former assistant Thomas Watson in San Francisco, a deliberate and widely publicised echo of the very first words Bell had ever spoken over a telephone line back in his own Boston laboratory, close to 4 decades earlier, and the company Bell's own patents had grown into, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, built across these same decades into a nationwide network under a deliberate corporate strategy its own president articulated in 1907 as one policy, one system, universal service, a strategy that let ATT operate for the whole of the following 7 decades as a government-tolerated monopoly specifically because federal regulators judged a single unified national telephone network more valuable to the public than the kind of open competition antitrust law generally demanded. An exception to the whole trust-busting story this evening has already told at length, and one that would not itself be undone until a 1982 consent decree finally broke the Bell system apart into separate regional companies, close to 8 decades after Standard Oil had suffered very nearly the identical fate for the opposite reason. A single private banker who did what the entire federal government of the United States, at that point in its own history, still could not. Notice, too, the specific and genuinely strange episode that revealed exactly how much unofficial power had come to concentrate by the early 1900s in the hands of the same J. Pierpont Morgan who had assembled United States Steel. Because the United States, alone among the major industrial powers of the period, still had no central bank of any kind in 1907, the second Bank of the United States having been allowed to expire back in the 1830s amid the same Jacksonian suspicion of concentrated financial power that had shaped so much of the nation's own earlier political argument, leaving the country's own banking system without any official institution capable of acting as a lender of last resort when a genuine financial panic actually struck. When a failed attempt to corner the market in a single copper mining company's own stock triggered a cascading crisis of confidence across October of 1907, depositors lining up outside banks and trust companies across New York City to withdraw their own savings before those same institutions could collapse, it was Morgan himself by this point in his 70s and acting entirely on his own private initiative rather than at any government's request, who summoned the heads of New York's major banks to his own private library on a Sunday evening, locked the doors, and personally directed over the following 2 weeks a coordinated rescue effort, pledging his own considerable personal fortune alongside pooled funds from the other assembled bankers to prop up the specific institutions he judged fundamentally sound, while deliberately allowing weaker, poorly managed firms to fail, a single private citizen effectively performing, through sheer personal authority and a lifetime of accumulated financial relationships, the exact stabilising function a modern central bank exists specifically to perform. Follow too exactly what that same episode actually persuaded Congress to finally do, because the spectacle of an entire nation's financial stability having depended in a moment of genuine crisis on the private judgment and the private fortune of one ageing banker struck a considerable number of legislators across both political parties as an arrangement no serious modern industrial power ought to continue tolerating, and Congress moved across the following 6 years to study the problem in detail and ultimately to pass the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating, for the first time since the old second bank's own expiry 7 decades earlier, an official central banking system with the specific and explicit mandate of providing exactly the kind of emergency liquidity Morgan had supplied out of his own private pocket in 1907, a piece of institutional reform this evening would ask you to hold as one further quiet but genuinely consequential piece of the engine's own final assembly, built, like so much of what came before it, not out of any careful advanced planning but out of the panicked improvisation a genuine crisis had forced into being. A ship's steerage deck crowded with people who had sold nearly everything they owned for a ticket, and the island built specifically to process them. The story turns now to the specific human material that actually fed this whole enormous industrial engine, because none of the steel mills or oil refineries or railroad yards this evening has spent so long describing could have run at anything approaching the scale they actually achieved without an extraordinary and historically unprecedented wave of immigration. Some 20 million people arriving in the United States between 1880 and 1924 alone, a great many of them from regions of Europe, southern Italy, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, Greece and the Balkans, that had sent comparatively few emigrants to America in earlier decades, drawn by wages that, however meagre by the standards a modern listener would recognise, still exceeded what the same labour could earn in the villages and towns these same immigrants had left behind and processed for the millions who arrived by ship into New York Harbour after 1892 through a newly built federal immigration station on a small island the ferries called Ellis Island, where inspectors conducted rapid medical examinations, checking eyelids for the trachoma that could mean instant deportation, and brief legal interviews. The overwhelming majority of arrivals, something in the range of 98% of everyone who actually reached the island's own processing halls, ultimately admitted within a matter of hours. A bureaucratic gateway so central to the whole experience of arrival that a considerable number of immigrant families in the decades since have continued referring to it, half in memory and half in family legend, as the Island of Tears for the small minority turned away, and the Golden Door for the overwhelming majority who passed through. Mark II, exactly where this same enormous new immigrant population actually ended up living once it reached the cities where the mills and the mines and the garment shops actually needed its labour, because a considerable share of the new arrivals settled into densely packed urban neighbourhoods, the Lower East Side of Manhattan chief among them, in a distinctive style of urban housing called the dumbbell tenement. Narrow buildings, typically 5 or 6 stories tall, pinched inward at the middle to create the air shaft that gave the design its own name, a design that satisfied the minimal legal requirements of an 1879 housing reform law, requiring every room to have some access to outside air and light while still packing. In practice, dozens of families into buildings originally designed for a fraction of that number, rooms without their own direct window opening instead onto a narrow air shaft that provided, in the documented experience of a great many residents, considerably more in the way of shared noise, shared cooking odours, and accumulated garbage than any genuine ventilation. Conditions a landmark 1901 investigative report by the photographer and reformer Jacob Riis, who had himself emigrated from Denmark 2 decades earlier and lived for a period in genuine poverty before establishing himself as a journalist, documented in exhaustive and deliberately unflinching photographic detail in a book titled How the Other Half Lives. Images of families of 8 and 10 crowded into 2-room apartments, of children sleeping on fire escapes in summer heat. No tenement interior could adequately relieve. That shocked a considerable share of the city's own more comfortable readership into genuine and, in a handful of specific cases, genuinely effective housing reform. A 23-year-old garment worker who stood up, uninvited, at a union meeting and asked the men running it a single blunt question none of them had actually planned on answering that night. Trace, plainly, the labour uprising that had already tried, 2 years before the Triangle Fire this evening is about to describe, to force exactly the reforms that fire would eventually make unavoidable. Because in November of 1909, at a mass meeting of New York garment workers called to discuss a possible strike, a 23-year-old shirtwaist maker named Clara Lemlich, herself a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant who had already been beaten by police and hired strikebreakers on earlier, smaller picket lines, grew frustrated with the male union officials on the stage speaking, in her own later account, at considerable length without actually calling for a vote, and demanded in Yiddish the floor, moving a resolution for an immediate general strike of the entire shirtwaist industry, a motion the crowd seconded and adopted by acclamation on the spot, touching off what came to be called the Uprising of the 20,000, the largest strike by American women workers the country had yet seen. Some 20,000 garment workers, the overwhelming majority of them young immigrant women very much like the workers this evening will shortly describe, trapped inside the Triangle factory, walking out across the following weeks of a genuinely brutal winter. Watch, too, exactly what that same strike actually achieved, and exactly what it did not, because the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, organising the strike, won improved wages and shorter hours from the great majority of the shirtwaist manufacturers, who eventually settled individually with their own workers, rather than continue absorbing the strike's own mounting losses. A genuine victory for the same International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This evening would ask you to remember was already actively organising New York's garment trade by 1909, and it is worth naming, with real and bitter irony, that the Triangle Shirtwaist Company itself was among the small minority of manufacturers that refused to settle with the union at all, continuing to operate as a non-union shop specifically because its own owners had successfully resisted exactly the safety and workplace reforms the union had been demanding, so that when fire broke out on the Triangle factory's own 8th floor 16 months later, it broke out inside one of the very few remaining workplaces the uprising of the 20,000 had failed to actually reach, a fire that lasted 18 minutes, and the specific locked door that turned it into a massacre. Follow, plainly, the single event that did more than perhaps any other to expose exactly what conditions inside the garment factories that employed a considerable share of this same immigrant workforce, young immigrant women especially, actually looked like, because on the 25th of March, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, occupying the top 3 floors of a building in Lower Manhattan and employing several hundred workers, the overwhelming majority of them young Jewish and Italian immigrant women working long shifts sewing the popular blouses called shirtwaists, and spread, within minutes, through cutting room floors covered in loose fabric scraps and tissue paper patterns that the factory's own owners had never systematically cleared, and it is worth naming, honestly and without softening it, exactly why so many workers who might otherwise have escaped the fire itself instead died trapped inside the building, because the factory's own owners, in a standard practice across the garment industry intended to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing small quantities of fabric, routinely kept the stairwell doors leading to one of the building's 2 exits locked from the outside during working hours, and the building's single fire escape, undersized and poorly maintained, collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers within minutes of the fire's own start. Consider, too, exactly what witnesses on the street below actually watched happen across those same 18 minutes, because with the stairwell exit locked and the fire escape collapsed, a considerable number of workers trapped on the 9th floor chose to jump from the windows rather than be burned alive, falling in full view of a horrified crowd that had gathered on the street below, including, by coincidence, several prominent labour reformers and journalists who would go on to make the fire's own aftermath a genuine turning point in American labour law. And by the time the fire itself had finally been brought under control, 146 workers, the overwhelming majority of them women, several as young as 14, lay dead, either from the fire itself or from the fall. And it is hard not to notice, finally, the specific and genuinely bitter legal outcome that followed, because the factory's own two owners, tried on manslaughter charges for the locked stairwell door, were acquitted by a jury that accepted their own defence's argument that the owners could not be proven to have personally known the specific door in question was locked at the specific moment the fire broke out, a verdict that struck a considerable share of the grieving public as a plain miscarriage of justice. But that also helped galvanise, within the following 2 years, a wave of genuinely substantial New York State factory safety legislation, mandatory fire drills, unlocked exits, sprinkler system requirements, and improved fire escape standards, reforms championed in the state legislature by a young assemblyman named Al Smith and a young state senator named Robert Wagner, both of whom would go on to considerably longer careers in progressive reform politics that traced their own origin, by their own later account, directly back to what they had personally witnessed in the fire's own immediate aftermath. A golden door that a Congress increasingly anxious about, exactly who was walking through it, moved, within barely a decade, to narrow almost shut. Mark, plainly, exactly how this whole extraordinary wave of immigration that had staffed the mills and the mines and the garment shops this evening has spent so long describing actually came to its own abrupt legislative end, because the same nativist anxiety that had greeted earlier waves of Irish and German immigration in the mid-19th century intensified across the 1890s and the early 1900s into an organised political movement specifically targeting the newer wave of Southern and Eastern European immigrants this evening has already described, a movement that found its own most consequential legislative expression in the Immigration Act of 1924, which established for the first time in American history strict numerical quotas on immigration from each individual country, calculated using a formula deliberately designed, its own congressional sponsors stated openly at the time, to preserve the existing ethnic composition of the American population by basing each nation's own quota on a census taken decades earlier, before the larger waves of Italian, Polish and Jewish immigration this evening as already described had significantly arrived, a formula that cut immigration from Italy from over 200,000 people a year in the law's own immediate prior years to scarcely 4,000 and excluded immigration from most of Asia entirely, extending and hardening a prohibition on Chinese immigration Congress had first imposed as far back as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, passed, with a bitter irony this evening's own listeners will recognise, barely 13 years after Chinese labourers had finished blasting the Central Pacific's own tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. Way too exactly what this same abrupt legislative closure actually did to the industrial workforce this whole engine had depended on for the preceding 4 decades, because annual immigration to the United States, which had run to well over 1 million people a year in several peak years before the First World War, fell to a small fraction of that figure across the following 4 decades, a closure that coincided not entirely by accident with the same period this evening has already described American industry beginning to substitute machinery and standardise mass production techniques for the sheer volume of unskilled immigrant labour its own earlier decades had depended on so completely, and it would not be until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 finally abolished the national origins quota system altogether, replacing it with a system oriented instead around family reunification and needed labour skills that the United States reopened, in anything resembling its own earlier scale, to the kind of broad global immigration that had built so much of the engine this whole evening has spent the night describing. A 4-decade closure this evening would ask you to hold as one further quieter chapter in the same story of who this whole engine's own considerable rewards were and were not actually built to include. A bomb thrown into a crowd of policemen and a movement blamed for violence it had almost certainly not committed. We arrive now at the broader organised labour movement this evening has already glimpsed in the Lowell Mill strikes and the Homestead Battle. Because American workers, across the same decades, this whole story has been describing enormous gains in industrial output, organised repeatedly and with real and often bitterly contested success, to demand some share of that same growing prosperity for themselves, the Knights of Labour emerging in the 1870s as the first genuinely large American labour organisation, welcoming, unusually for its own era, both skilled and unskilled workers, and, in a considerable number of its own local branches, women and black workers as well, growing to claim a membership of some 700,000 people by the mid-1880s, before a single catastrophic event in Chicago did lasting damage to its own public reputation. On the 4th of May, 1886, during a labour rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square, called to protest police violence against striking workers the day before, someone, to this day never conclusively identified, threw a homemade bomb into a line of advancing police officers, killing one instantly and setting off a chaotic exchange of gunfire that left several more officers and an unknown number of civilians dead, and the ensuing trial, conducted amid a wave of genuine public panic about foreign anarchist violence, convicted 8 labour activists, several of whom had not even been present at the square when the bomb was thrown, based on evidence that a great many legal historians since have judged to have been thin at best, sentencing 4 to death by hanging, a verdict a considerable share of the international labour movement came to regard as a grave miscarriage of justice, and one that a sympathetic Illinois governor named John Peter Altgeld formally pardoned the surviving defendants over 6 years later, in 1893, explicitly citing the trial's own documented unfairness, a pardon that cost Altgeld a considerable share of his own political career, but that stands, examined honestly, as one of the more genuinely principled acts by any sitting American governor across the whole of this story. Examine too exactly how the labour movement reorganised itself in Haymarket's own bruising aftermath, caused the Knights of Labour's own membership collapsed across the following decade, as public opinion turned sharply against organised labour generally, and leadership within the movement passed instead to a considerably narrower and considerably more pragmatic organisation, the American Federation of Labour, founded in 1886 under the leadership of a cigar maker named Samuel Gompers, who deliberately organised the AFL around skilled craft workers, specifically plumbers, cigar makers, printers, carpenters, rather than the broader inclusive membership the Knights. The company itself set a system of dependency the popular song later immortalised in the line about owing one's own soul to the company store. Take note too of the specific and genuinely violent confrontation this same system eventually provoked in the hills of West Virginia, because when coal miners across Logan and Mingo counties organised, in the summer of 1921, to unionize despite fierce and often armed company resistance, a standoff between several thousand armed union miners and a considerably smaller force of coal company guards, local sheriffs, and eventually federal troops escalated into the Battle of Blair Mountain, the largest armed labour uprising in American history and, by most careful modern estimates, the largest armed civilian uprising of any kind on American soil since the Civil War itself. A 5-day battle involving, by its own end, private airplanes hired by mine owners to drop homemade bombs on the assembled miners' own positions, a tactic of aerial bombardment used against striking American workers on American soil that a considerable number of modern readers, encountering it for the first time, find genuinely difficult to believe actually happened, ended only when federal troops, dispatched by President Warren Harding, intervened directly in the outnumbered miners, unwilling to fire on soldiers wearing the same uniform many of them had themselves worn only a few years earlier in the First World War, laid down their own arms, a defeat that set the United Mine Workers back for close to a decade and a half, until the same National Labour Relations Act this evening, as already described, finally gave coal miners, alongside every other American industrial worker, a legally protected path to the union recognition Blair Mountain had failed to win by force. A president who had watched a coal strike nearly freeze an entire winter's worth of American cities and decided the government itself needed a bigger stick than any single trust could match. Way, plainly, the specific political movement this whole accumulating pattern of trusts, strikes, and tenement fires eventually provoked into government action, because a loose coalition of reformers, journalists, and elected officials who came to be called progressives spent the 2 decades bridging the turn of the 20th century pushing, with real and escalating success, for government regulation of exactly the concentrated corporate power this evening has spent so long describing, building on a Sherman Antitrust Act Congress had actually passed as early as 1890, outlawing, in fairly broad and for its own first decade largely unenforced language, any contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of interstate trade, a law federal courts and federal prosecutors in its own early years applied, with a genuinely striking irony, considerably more aggressively against labour unions organising boycotts than against the industrial trusts the law's own authors had actually meant to target. Remember, too, exactly what changed once Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 following William McKinley's assassination, because Roosevelt, who described himself as a genuine friend of what he called legitimate, well-behaved big business, while remaining a committed enemy of what he called bad trusts that abused their own market power against the public interest, directed his own Justice Department to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company assembled by Morgan himself, and won a Supreme Court ruling in 1904 ordering it dissolved, the first major victory in what newspapers of the period took to calling trust busting, and followed that same victory with dozens of further antitrust suits across his own 2 terms in office, intervening personally in the coal strike of 1902 to broker a settlement between striking Pennsylvania coal miners and mine owners, rather than simply sending in troops on the mine owners' behalf, as Cleveland had done at Pullman, a genuinely novel assertion of the federal government's own willingness to treat itself as a neutral referee between capital and labour, rather than as capital's automatic ally, a role Roosevelt's own successors would continue to expand in fits and starts and with real political resistance at every step, across the following 3 decades, Woodrow Wilson's own administration adding, in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission, a standing regulatory agency empowered to investigate and prohibit unfair business practices on an ongoing basis rather than requiring the Justice Department to mount an entirely fresh lawsuit each time a new trust emerged, and the Clayton Antitrust Act, closing several of the specific loopholes that had let earlier trusts, Standard Oil among them, restructure around the original 1890 Sherman Act's own somewhat vague language, a legislative 1-2 combination that gave the federal government for the first time a genuinely permanent regulatory infrastructure for policing concentrated corporate power rather than relying, as Roosevelt himself largely had, on the considerably slower and considerably less predictable process of case-by-case litigation, culminating, this evening we'll describe shortly, in a new deal that finally established, in permanent federal law, the workers' own right to organise and bargain collectively, that the Homestead strikers and the Pullman boycotters had fought and largely lost for without any such legal protection at all. A novel written to expose the exploitation of the immigrant worker that ended up, to its own author's considerable and lasting frustration, exposing something else to the public entirely, examined plainly, one further piece of progressive-era reform that reached considerably beyond the factories and the trust this evening has already described, because a young socialist writer named Upton Sinclair spent 7 weeks in 1904 working undercover inside Chicago's own meatpacking plants specifically to document the exploitation of the immigrant labourers employed there, and published the following year a novel called The Jungle, depicting, in graphic and deliberately unflinching detail, both the brutal working conditions and the genuinely horrifying unsanitary practices, spoiled meat treated with chemicals to disguise the smell, dead rats swept directly into sausage-grinding machinery that the novel alleged were routine inside the plants, and it is worth naming, with real and lasting irony, exactly what actually happened once the book became a national sensation, because Sinclair had written the novel hoping to provoke public outrage over the workers' own suffering, and later remarked, in a line that has been quoted by labour historians ever since, that he had aimed for the public's heart and hit its stomach instead, American readers responding not primarily to the immigrant labourers' own documented exploitation, but to their own sudden fear of what might actually be inside the meat their own families were eating. Consider, too, exactly what that same public reaction actually produced in Washington, because President Roosevelt, who had already been moving toward food safety reform before the novel's own publication, ordered his own independent federal investigation into the meatpacking industry, an investigation that substantially corroborated Sinclair's own most alarming claims and used the resulting public pressure to push the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act through Congress within months, in June of 1906 establishing for the first time in American federal law mandatory government inspection of meat sold across state lines, and a formal prohibition on the adulteration and mislabeling of food and drugs generally, laws that created, in the federal agency structure that would eventually grow into the modern Food and Drug Administration, one further permanent piece of the same broader regulatory apparatus this whole evening has already described antitrust law and workplace safety law, contributing to, born, like a considerable share of that same apparatus, not from careful advanced planning, but from a single writer's own investigative anger landing, almost by accident, on precisely the fear that happened to move an entire nation's Congress to act, a continent away from the trenches, and still somehow the war's own decisive arsenal. We turn now to the first of two world wars that would each, in strikingly similar ways, force this whole enormous engine to prove exactly how fast it could actually be redirected toward a single, overriding national purpose. Because when war broke out across Europe in the summer of 1914, the United States initially remained formally neutral for close to 3 years, and American industry, even before the country's own eventual entry into the fighting in April of 1917, had already begun supplying the Allied powers, Britain and France especially, with an enormous and rapidly growing volume of munitions, steel, and food, American exports to the Allied nations rising from roughly $800 million in 1914 to well over $3 billion by 1916. A wartime trade that pulled the American economy decisively out of a mild pre-war recession, and that left American bankers, Morgan's own firm foremost among them, holding an enormous and directly self-interested stake in an eventual Allied victory by the time the United States itself finally entered the war, sit with too exactly how the federal government actually organised the nation's own industrial base once American troops themselves began deploying to France, because Congress created the War Industries Board in the summer of 1917, eventually placing it under the direction of a Wall Street financier named Bernard Baruch, who was granted, for the first time in American peacetime or wartime history, genuinely sweeping authority to standardize industrial production, allocate scarce raw materials among competing manufacturers, and set prices across huge swathes of the American economy, converting, within a matter of months, factories that had never previously built so much as a single military rifle into producers of artillery shells, gas masks, and steel helmets, a degree of centralized economic coordination that struck a considerable number of contemporary American business leaders as startlingly close to the kind of state-directed economy the nation's own political tradition had always defined itself against. But that proved, in the narrow and urgent context of a wartime emergency, remarkably effective at mobilizing American industrial capacity at a speed and a scale the private market alone had never previously been asked to achieve. Take note, too, of exactly who filled the considerable labour gap this same wartime mobilization opened up, because with several million working-age American men serving overseas and immigration from Europe sharply curtailed by the war itself, American industry turned, in numbers considerably larger than in any previous decade, to two workforces it had historically excluded from its own best-paying industrial jobs: women who took up positions in munitions plants, steel mills, and shipyards in numbers that would recede but never fully disappear once the war itself ended, and black Americans migrating out of the rural South in what historians now call the Great Migration, a movement that had already begun before the war but that accelerated sharply across these same years, some 500,000 black Americans relocating to northern industrial cities, Chicago, Detroit and Pittsburgh especially, between 1916 and 1920 alone, seeking industrial wages considerably higher than anything available to them under the sharecropping and legal segregation that still governed the rural South, even as they encountered, in a pattern this evening's own later hours will return to directly, a northern industrial workforce and a northern housing market that extended those same higher wages while still, in practice, systematically denying black workers the best paying skilled positions and the best available housing that white workers, immigrant and native-born alike, continued to receive. A moving line that a bicycle repair mechanic's obsession turned into the defining machine of the following American century. It is worth turning now to the single specific manufacturing innovation that did more than perhaps any other to define what American industry actually looked like across the prosperous decade that followed the war's own end, because Henry Ford, who had spent years tinkering with internal combustion engines in a Detroit workshop while employed as an engineer for Thomas Edison's own electric company, introduced at his own Highland Park, Michigan plant in 1913 a moving assembly line for automobile production, borrowing and adapting the basic principle from the moving overhead rail systems already used in Chicago's own meatpacking plants to disassemble carcasses, but applying it, for the first time at genuine industrial scale, to the considerably more complex task of assembling a finished automobile, breaking the process down into a long sequence of small, simple, endlessly repeated individual tasks performed by workers who no longer moved around a stationary vehicle, but instead stood in place while the vehicle itself moved steadily past them on a continuously advancing conveyor. Notice too exactly what that same innovation actually did to both the price and the production speed of the Ford Model T, because the time required to assemble a single Model T chassis fell, within roughly a year of the moving line's own introduction, from something in the range of 12.5 hours of combined labour to under 2 hours, a productivity gain so dramatic that Ford was able to cut the Model T's own retail price repeatedly across the following decade, even as demand for the vehicle continued climbing, from $850 when the model first launched in 1908 to under $300 by the early 1920s, bringing automobile ownership for the first time in the vehicle's own short history within genuine reach of a considerable share of ordinary American working families, rather than remaining, as it had been for its own first 2 decades, a luxury reserved almost entirely for the wealthy. Remember too the specific and genuinely startling decision Ford made in 1914 that a considerable number of his own fellow industrialists privately regarded as close to reckless, because Ford announced that January that he would pay his own factory workers a minimum wage of $5 a day, more than double the prevailing wage for comparable industrial labour at the time, alongside a reduction in the standard workday from 9 hours to 8, a decision Ford himself justified publicly, in terms that echoed and considerably extended Carnegie's own earlier stewardship rhetoric, by arguing that a well-paid workforce would be a more stable and more productive workforce, turning over jobs considerably less often than the exhausting, poorly compensated positions still standard across most of American industry, and that workers earning $5 a day would, not incidentally, become precisely the kind of customers who could eventually afford to buy the very cars they themselves were building, a genuinely self-reinforcing insight into mass consumer demand that a considerable number of economic historians since have credited as one of the conceptual foundations of the entire 20th century consumer economy. The automobile industry helped bring into being, even as it is worth naming honestly, that Ford's own factories paired this same generous wage with an intrusive private investigative department that monitored workers' own personal habits, drinking, gambling, marital conduct, outside working hours, docking or denying the full $5 wage to any worker its own investigators judged insufficiently moral or insufficiently thrifty, a paternalism considerably less generous than the headline wage figure alone ever fully suggested. Trace too exactly what this same combination of cheap, reliable, mass-produced automobiles and a rapidly growing base of workers who could actually afford to buy them did to the broader shape of American industry across the 1920s, because automobile registrations in the United States climbed from under 500,000 in 1910 to over 23 million by 1930, a boom that pulled an enormous and rapidly expanding secondary industrial economy along behind it. Steel for auto bodies, rubber for tyres, glass for windshields, petroleum refined into the gasoline, every one of those millions of new vehicles required, and paved roads, funded by a rapidly expanding system of state and federal highway spending to actually drive them on, so that by the decade's own end the automobile industry had become, directly and indirectly, the largest single sector of the entire American manufacturing economy. And Detroit, a modestly sized regional city at the century's own turn, had become one of the wealthiest and most rapidly growing industrial cities on the entire planet, its own downtown skyline rising across barely 2 decades into a genuine monument to exactly how completely a single manufacturing innovation could reorganize an entire national economy around itself. 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, and the 12 seconds that quietly founded an entire industry this evening would otherwise have had no occasion to mention until a war forced its own hand. Look, briefly, closely at one further manufacturing industry taking its own first uncertain steps across these same decades, because Wilbur and Orville Wright, who ran a small bicycle repair and manufacturing shop in Dayton, Ohio, achieved the first sustained, controlled, powered flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft on the sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the 17th of December 1903, a flight that covered a mere 120 feet and lasted only 12 seconds. But that opened, within barely a decade and a half, into a genuine manufacturing industry. A young timber merchant named William Boeing, founding his own aircraft company in Seattle in 1916, initially building seaplanes on not much more than personal enthusiasm and a considerable inherited fortune, and it is worth naming, too, exactly how completely the aviation industry's own true growth, like so much of the rest of this whole story, would ultimately arrive not through steady peacetime commercial demand, but through the same kind of overwhelming wartime necessity that built the steel mills and the Liberty ships this evening has already described. American aircraft production climbing from under 3,000 planes, built in the whole of 1939, to close to 100,000 planes, built in 1944 alone, the single year of the Second World War's own peak output. A wartime expansion that left Boeing and a handful of its own California-based rivals positioned, once peace returned, to build the commercial jet airliners that would, across the following 3 decades, make air travel routine for millions of ordinary Americans in a way it had never once been before the war forced the whole industry to grow up practically overnight. A wooden cabinet in the corner of the living room that, within the space of a single decade, went from a novelty few households owned to the single piece of furniture an entire family arranged its own evening around. It is worth naming, too, one further consumer industry that grew up alongside the automobile across these same 1920s, because commercial radio broadcasting barely existing at all, before Pittsburgh's own station KDKA began regular broadcasts in 1920, expanded so quickly across the following decade that the number of American households owning a radio receiver climbed from under 100,000 in 1922 to well over 12 million by 1930, a manufacturing boom built around the Radio Corporation of America, assembled in 1919 out of patents and assets belonging to General Electric, Westinghouse, and a handful of smaller firms specifically so that American radio manufacturing would not remain dependent on British-controlled patents, the way the young industry's own earliest years had briefly threatened. And it is worth naming too the considerably less glamorous but genuinely essential retail infrastructure that let all of this newly mass-produced abundance, radios and automobiles and ready-made clothing alike, actually reach the rural and small-town household still living, in the 1920s, a genuine distance from any large department store, because Sears, Roebuck and Company, building on a mail-order catalogue business it had operated since the 1890s, grew into what a considerable number of business historians have since called the physical embodiment of the whole mass consumption economy this evening has spent so long describing, a single annual catalogue running to over 1,000 pages and reaching, by the 1920s, into a considerable majority of American rural households, selling everything from ready-made houses shipped by rail in numbered lumber kits to the same radios and household appliances rolling off the very assembly lines this evening as already described. An engine that had grown so large and so fast that nobody, for a while, noticed it was running on credit it could not sustain. Notice plainly exactly how completely this whole soaring industrial and consumer boom collapsed within the space of a single terrible autumn, because the stock market crash of October 1929, in which the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost roughly a quarter of its own total value across barely a week of trading, exposed a set of underlying weaknesses the decade's own genuine industrial achievements had largely obscured. An agricultural sector that had never fully shared in the decade's own prosperity, and that carried, into the crash, an enormous burden of accumulated debt. A banking system still lacking the kind of systematic federal deposit protection that would have prevented a wave of ordinary depositor panic from turning isolated bank failures into a genuinely nationwide collapse, and an industrial production base that had, across the same boom years, expanded its own manufacturing capacity considerably faster than the wage growth of the ordinary workers who were supposed to eventually buy everything that capacity produced, so that American industrial production, which had climbed steadily and often spectacularly across the whole of the 1920s, fell by close to half between 1929 and its own eventual low point in 1933, and something in the range of 1 in 4 American workers stood entirely unemployed at the depths of the Great Depression, a collapse this evening's own listeners already understand, without needing the full and considerably longer story told at length here, reshaped American politics and American economic life for the whole of the following decade and beyond. Follow, too, exactly what the federal government's own response to that same collapse eventually did to the relationship between Washington and the industrial engine this whole evening has spent so long describing, because President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, enacted across his own first several years in office beginning in 1933, extended the federal government's own regulatory reach into the industrial economy considerably further than even Theodore Roosevelt's own trust-busting had gone a generation earlier, establishing federal deposit insurance to prevent the kind of banking panics that had helped deepen the crash, creating the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the stock market whose own excesses had helped trigger it, and passing, in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, guaranteeing, for the first time in American federal law, workers' own legal right to organize unions and bargain collectively without the kind of company-directed violence this evening has already described at Homestead and Pullman, a legal protection that fueled, across the following decade, a dramatic resurgence in American union membership, and that finally gave the industrial workforce this whole engine had depended on, from its own earliest years, a genuine and legally enforceable seat at the table that had, for the better part of the preceding 60 years, simply not existed. A concrete dam poured across a desert canyon by men working 3 rotating shifts around the clock, built specifically to put an idle industrial workforce back to productive use. Trace, too, the specific way the New Deal put the same enormous, but temporarily idled industrial capacity this evening, has already described sitting unused at the Depression's own depths back to work on public infrastructure. The private market alone had never found sufficiently profitable to build because the federal government funded, beginning in 1931, the construction of Hoover Dam across the Colorado River, a project that employed, at its own peak, over 5,000 workers pouring concrete in the brutal desert heat of the Nevada and Arizona border, working in shifts around the clock to complete, by 1935, what was then the largest concrete structure and the largest hydroelectric generating facility ever built anywhere on Earth, 2 years ahead of its own original schedule, and Congress, in 1933, created the Tennessee Valley Authority, a federal agency tasked with building a coordinated system of dams across one of the country's own poorest and least electrified regions, bringing flood control, navigable rivers, and, not incidentally, exactly the kind of affordable electric power this evening has already described the Rural Electrification Administration extending to isolated farms nationally, to a region private power companies had judged for decades simply not worth the investment. Consider too the specific and genuinely enormous scale of the broader public works programs the New Deal built around this same logic, because the Works Progress Administration, created in 1935, employed, across its own 8 years of operation, something in the range of 8.5 million Americans building roads, bridges, schools, airports and public buildings across every state in the country, and the Civilian Conservation Corps put close to 3 million young unemployed men to work planting trees, building park infrastructure, and fighting soil erosion across the same years, a level of direct federal employment considerably beyond anything the country's own political tradition had previously found acceptable, that nonetheless put the same underlying industrial machinery, cement production, steel fabrication, heavy construction equipment. This whole evening has spent so long describing back into productive motion, at a moment when the private market alone had proven, for the better part of a full decade, simply unable to do so on its own. A depression that 10 years of federal spending had only partially cured, and a second war that finished the job almost by accident. Follow finally the specific and genuinely uncomfortable historical truth that a great many economic historians have spent decades since carefully documenting, because for all of the New Deal's own genuine and lasting institutional achievements, American unemployment still stood at close to 15% as late as 1940, a full decade after the crash, and despite years of sustained federal spending, and it would take, in the end, not any peacetime economic program, but the same kind of overwhelming wartime mobilization. This evening has already described transforming American industry once before in 1917, arriving this time at a scale that would dwarf anything the First World War had ever required, to finally and fully end the Depression's own decade-long grip on the American economy. A radio address delivered from a fireside promising a nation still officially at peace that it would nonetheless become the arsenal the rest of the fighting world depended on. Mark plainly the specific phrase and the specific broadcast that gave this whole final and most dramatic chapter of the engine's own story its own lasting name, because President Roosevelt, addressing the American public in one of his own regular fireside radio chats on the 29th of December 1940, more than a full year before the United States itself would formally enter the Second World War, argued that even a still neutral America had a vital national interest in supplying Britain, and the other nations already fighting Nazi Germany with the weapons, ships and material they needed to continue that fight, declaring that the United States must become, in the phrase that gave the whole coming mobilization its own enduring name, the Great Arsenal of Democracy, a speech that helped build the political support Roosevelt needed to push the Lend-Lease Act through Congress barely 2 months later, authorizing the president to lend or lease military equipment to any nation whose own defense he judged vital to American security, a program that had already shipped billions of dollars in tanks, aircraft, and munitions to Britain, and, after Germany's invasion in June of 1941, to the Soviet Union as well before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into the war directly on the 7th of December that same year. Watch too exactly how completely American industry actually converted itself within a matter of months from a peacetime economy still only partially recovered from a decade of depression into the single largest war production machine the world had ever seen, because the federal government created the War Production Board in January of 1942, granting it sweeping authority considerably beyond even what Bernard Baruch's earlier War Industries Board had wielded in the First World War, to halt civilian automobile production entirely, redirect the nation's own steel, aluminum, and rubber supplies toward military priorities, and coordinate the conversion of factories across the entire country to war work, so that Ford's own enormous River Rouge complex, which had spent 2 decades building Model Ts and their own successors, retooled to produce tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines, and General Motors, Chrysler, and a host of smaller manufacturers converted their own assembly lines, with a speed that startled even the government officials directing the effort, American civilian automobile production, which had run to over 3 million vehicles in 1941, falling to just a few hundred specially authorized vehicles a year later, as nearly the entire industry pivoted to building the tanks, trucks, and aircraft the war actually required. A bomber built every 63 minutes, inside a single building nearly a mile long. Watch, plainly, the single specific factory that became, in the popular imagination of the period, and in a considerable amount of later historical memory besides, the clearest physical symbol of exactly what this whole converted industrial engine could actually achieve, because Ford built, at Willow Run outside Detroit, an entirely new bomber assembly plant, its own main building stretching nearly a mile in length, specifically to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, using the exact same moving assembly line principles Ford had pioneered for automobiles 3 decades earlier, a task that had never before been attempted for an aircraft of the B-24's own size and complexity, since aircraft manufacturing had traditionally been organised around small teams of skilled workers, building each plane largely by hand rather than around a continuously moving line. And Ford's own engineers spent months solving problems no automobile plant had ever previously faced, coordinating the assembly of some 30,000 individual parts per aircraft across a workforce that, at its own wartime peak, exceeded 40,000 people, a considerable share of them women and workers with no prior industrial experience of any kind, trained from scratch specifically for this single purpose. The plant, dismissed by early skeptics, Charles Lindbergh among them, as an overly ambitious folly unlikely to ever hit its own announced targets, struggled badly through its own first year of operation, producing only a handful of aircraft a month against a promised rate of 1 an hour, but by 1944 had refined its own process to the point of producing a completed B-24 bomber, rolling off the line finished and ready to fly at a peak rate of 1 every 63 minutes, having built, across the whole of the war, over 8,000 of the roughly 19,000 B-24s built in total across every American factory combined. Picture too the parallel and in some ways even more startling achievement of a shipbuilder named Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship of any kind before the war began, and whose own prior career had run through highway construction and the Hoover Dam project, because Kaiser applied the same principle of standardized, prefabricated mass production to an entirely different and traditionally far slower industry, building a fleet of shipyards along the American West Coast to mass produce a standardized cargo vessel called the Liberty ship, welding prefabricated hull sections built separately at multiple locations rather than riveting each individual plate by hand as traditional shipbuilding had always done, cutting the time required to build a single 10,000-ton cargo vessel from what had traditionally taken the better part of a year down to, in Kaiser's own most celebrated and most publicised example, a single Liberty ship named the Robert E. Peary, assembled from keel laying to full launch in just 4 days and 15 hours, a stunt deliberately timed and publicised for its own considerable propaganda value, but that nonetheless reflected a genuinely dramatic underlying production achievement. Kaiser's own yards and their many imitators launching across the whole of the war, close to 2,700 Liberty ships in total, a volume of cargo shipping so enormous that it single-handedly replaced several times over every ton of Allied shipping. German submarines managed to sink across the entire Battle of the Atlantic. A riveter who was never, strictly speaking, a single real person, and the millions of actual women whose own labour she came to represent. It is worth naming too exactly who actually built these same tanks and bombers and ships once the male workforce that had traditionally filled American factories departed by the millions for military service overseas, because something in the range of 6 million American women entered the industrial workforce for the first time across the course of the war, taking up positions in aircraft plants, shipyards and munitions factories that had, before the war, been reserved almost entirely for men. A wave of new industrial labour the government's own wartime propaganda office celebrated through a fictional composite figure named Rosie the Riveter, popularised through a widely circulated poster and a popular wartime song, an image that, however idealised and however carefully calibrated for its own recruitment purposes, nonetheless reflected a genuine and historically unprecedented transformation in exactly who American heavy industry actually employed, and it is worth naming, honestly, that this same wartime opening proved, for the considerable majority of the women who experienced it, a temporary rather than permanent one. A great many factories and unions moving quickly once the war itself ended and millions of returning male veterans needed jobs, to push women back out of the highest paying industrial positions and back toward the more limited range of clerical and service work considered, by the era's own still dominant social expectations, more properly feminine. A reversal this evening will return to directly in its own proper place among the several ledgers this whole story still has left to settle, honestly. A community of American citizens whose own businesses and whose own farms were seized by the very government asking every other citizen to sacrifice for the war effort. Weigh, too, and without softening it, the single most direct betrayal. This same wartime mobilization visited on a specific group of its own American citizens, because President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, authorizing the forced removal and imprisonment of roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, close to 2/3 of them native-born United States citizens, from the West Coast into a network of remote internment camps, a policy justified publicly on entirely unsubstantiated grounds of military necessity that later government investigation would formally acknowledge, in 1988, had actually been driven by what an official congressional commission termed race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, and it is worth naming, honestly, the direct economic cost this same policy inflicted, because Japanese American families, given in many documented cases only days to prepare, were forced to sell homes, farms and businesses built up across 2 and sometimes 3 generations at a small fraction of their own actual value, or simply abandon them outright, losses a later federal commission estimated, even using deliberately conservative 1940s dollar figures, at several $100 million, property and businesses that, in a great many cases, had themselves been quietly feeding directly into the very same wartime agricultural and small manufacturing economy. This evening has spent so long describing running at full capacity, a desert laboratory working toward a weapon so new that most of the physicists building it were not entirely certain, until the actual morning it was tested, that it would work at all. Examine finally the single most consequential and most ethically fraught piece of this entire wartime industrial mobilization, because the Manhattan Project, the top-secret federal program to develop a functional atomic weapon before Nazi Germany's own considerably feared nuclear research program, could do so first, eventually employed, across its own several years of operation, well over 100,000 people spread across a network of specially built facilities, a uranium enrichment complex at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a plutonium production complex at Hanford, Washington, and a weapons design laboratory built essentially from nothing on a remote New Mexico mesa at Los Alamos, under the overall scientific direction of a physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer, consuming, across its own total run, close to $2 billion, an almost unimaginable sum for the period, and representing in its own combination of enormous industrial construction, advanced theoretical physics, and absolute wartime secrecy, very nearly the furthest possible extension of exactly the kind of centrally directed, government-financed industrial mobilization this whole evening has spent so long describing, arriving at last at its own most terrible and most world-altering application, the first successful test of a functional atomic weapon occurring at a site in the New Mexico desert, the project's own scientists codenamed Trinity on the 16th of July, 1945, followed within a month by the weapon's own actual use against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an act that ended the war within days, but that opened, for the whole of the following 8 decades and continuing into the present night, this evening is being told inside an entirely new and permanently altered relationship between industrial capacity, scientific research, and the sheer physical scale of destruction a single nation's own engine could now unleash. An engine that, by the war's own final tally, had simply outproduced every other combatant nation on Earth combined. Take note plainly of the raw output this entire wartime mobilization actually achieved, because the United States produced, across the whole of the Second World War, something in the range of 297,000 military aircraft, over 88,000 tanks, roughly 71,000 naval vessels of every size and class, and munitions and equipment of every other kind in a volume that, added together, exceeded the combined military production of Germany, Japan and Italy put together, a level of output that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin himself, at a wartime conference with Roosevelt and Churchill, reportedly toasted directly, telling his own American counterpart that without American production, the Allies could never have won the war at all. And it is worth remembering honestly that this same staggering wartime output arrived at real and considerable human cost, as well as staggering achievement, industrial accident rates in hastily converted and rapidly staffed wartime factories running well above pre-war norms, and the same racial and gender barriers this evening has already described in earlier decades, persisting in modified but genuinely real form, even inside factories desperate enough for labour to finally, if only partially and only temporarily, open their own doors to workers they had spent the whole of the preceding 60 years systematically excluding. A ration book that decided week to week exactly how much sugar and gasoline and rubber an ordinary American household was actually permitted to use. Remember too exactly what this same total industrial mobilization actually felt like inside the ordinary households whose own factories were now running around the clock because the Federal Office of Price Administration issued ration books to every American household beginning in 1942, limiting purchases of sugar, coffee, meat, gasoline, and rubber tires to whatever quantity a family's own allotted coupons permitted, a system enforced through local volunteer ration boards and through a genuinely widespread and largely voluntary culture of public shaming for anyone caught trading on the black market that inevitably grew up alongside it, and Americans planted, on the government's own explicit encouragement, an estimated 20 million so-called victory gardens in backyards, vacant lots, and public parks, producing by the war's own final year something in the range of 1/3 of all the fresh vegetables consumed domestically across the entire country, a level of direct civilian participation in the war's own material logistics considerably more intimate and considerably more constant than anything the First World War's own more limited mobilization had asked of ordinary households a generation earlier. Weigh, too, the specific and genuinely enormous sums ordinary Americans lent their own government to help pay for all of it, because the Treasury Department, drawing directly on the same small denomination bond-selling techniques Jay Cook had pioneered during the Civil War this evening, has already described, launched a series of war bond drives across the whole of the conflict, employing Hollywood film stars for public rallies and selling bonds through workplace payroll deduction programs that reached deep into the ordinary industrial workforce actually building the tanks and the bombers, raising, across 8 separate bond drives between 1942 and 1945, close to $185 billion from tens of millions of individual American purchasers, a sum that financed roughly half of the entire war's own total cost, and that left a considerable share of the ordinary American public, for the first time in the nation's history, with a direct personal financial stake in a war effort that was, simultaneously, and for the very same households, providing the best-paying and most abundant industrial employment most of them had ever known, a workforce that had spent 4 years being told its own labour was a patriotic sacrifice, and that stopped almost the moment the war actually ended, being willing to keep making it for free. Look, too, closely at exactly what happened the instant this same wartime discipline was no longer being asked of American workers by an active national emergency, because the same labour unions that had, for the most part, honoured a self-imposed no-strike pledge across the whole of the war, rather than disrupt the production this evening has spent so long describing, walked out almost immediately once peace actually arrived. Some 5 million American workers, steel workers, coal miners, auto workers, and electrical workers among them, participating in strikes across 1945 and 1946 in what remains, by total days of work stopped, the largest strike wave in the whole of American history, workers demanding wage increases to offset the wartime price controls finally being lifted and to compensate for the overtime pay that had disappeared the moment factories stopped running around the clock. A wave of labour unrest that alarmed a considerable share of the American public, and that helped produce, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act, passed by a newly Republican-controlled Congress over President Truman's own veto, restricting several of the organising tactics the National Labour Relations Act had guaranteed a decade earlier, and marking, a great many labour historians have since argued, the high-water mark of federal support for organised labour beginning to recede almost as soon as it had been reached. Examine, too, exactly how the very same industrial plant this evening has just finished describing converted, within a matter of months, from tanks and bombers, back to the civilian automobiles and household appliances, an entire generation of Americans had gone without for the whole of the war, because the same production lines at Willow Run and at Ford's own River Rouge complex that had built B-24 bombers switched back to building cars within weeks of the war's own end, and American automobile production, which had fallen to a token handful of specially authorised vehicles during the war itself, roared back to over 2 million vehicles in 1946 alone, and climbed steadily across the following decade, a pent-up consumer demand from years of rationing and wartime saving, pouring directly into the same industrial engine this whole evening has spent so long describing and providing, alongside the GI Bill and the highway. Spending this evening has already named the specific immediate fuel for the suburban and consumer boom of the following decade. A world where every other major industrial power had just finished bombing its own factories into rubble, and one where the factories had never once been touched. It is worth naming plainly exactly what state the United States actually found itself in once the guns finally fell silent in the late summer of 1945. Because while the industrial heartlands of Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France all lay, to widely varying but uniformly serious degrees, in physical ruin, cities and factories and rail networks bombed, shelled, and in several cases deliberately demolished Across 6 years of continuous fighting, the continental United States had experienced across the entire war no direct enemy bombing of its own industrial base at all, so that the same engine that had just outproduced every other combatant nation on Earth combined emerged from the war not merely intact, but, in a great many specific industries, considerably larger and considerably more technically advanced than it had been the day the war began, an asymmetry so complete that the United States, holding roughly 6% of the entire world's population in 1945, accounted by most careful contemporary economic estimates for something in the range of half of the entire planet's total manufacturing output, a share of global industrial production no single nation had ever held before in the whole of recorded economic history, and that no single nation has come anywhere close to matching again since. Consider too exactly what the United States actually did with that same unprecedented position, because rather than simply enjoying its own uncontested industrial supremacy in isolation, American policymakers moved, across the following several years, to build an entirely new international economic architecture with the American engine deliberately placed at its own centre. Delegates from 44 Allied nations meeting at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July of 1944, even before the war itself had fully ended, to establish a new global monetary system built around the American dollar, convertible directly into gold at a fixed rate, and held by every other participating nation's own central bank as the primary reserve currency underpinning the whole of post-war international trade. And Congress, in 1948, approved the European Recovery Programme, popularly known as the Marshall Plan after the Secretary of State who proposed it, committing something in the range of $13 billion, a genuinely enormous sum for the period, to rebuilding the shattered industrial economies of Western Europe, a programme driven by a combination of genuine humanitarian concern, hard-nosed strategic calculation about preventing communist political movements from filling the vacuum left by economic collapse, and a plain recognition that American factories would eventually need healthy overseas trading partners capable of actually buying what they produced. Notice, too, exactly how completely this same post-war moment reorganised ordinary American domestic life around the engine's own continued output, because millions of returning veterans, aided by the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, popularly known as the GI Bill, used federally guaranteed low-interest loans to purchase homes in newly built suburban developments. The mass-produced tract housing of communities like Levittown, New York, built using construction techniques directly borrowed from the same wartime standardization and prefabrication principles Kaiser had used to build Liberty ships, and Congress, in 1956, authorized the interstate highway system, 41,000 miles of limited-access highway justified publicly in part on the same national defense logic that had once justified the Pacific Railway Acts a century earlier, a road network that, once built, would carry the automobiles Detroit's own factories were now producing at a rate approaching 8 million vehicles a year by the 1950s, an entire domestic economy, suburban housing, highway construction, automobile manufacturing, home appliance production, television manufacturing, feeding directly back into the same industrial engine this whole evening has spent so long describing, so that by the middle of the 1950s, median American household income, adjusted for inflation, had roughly doubled since the eve of the war, and a considerable share of the American working and middle classes experienced, across this single post-war decade, a rise in material living standards that would have seemed, to Carnegie's own bobbin boy childhood, or to the immigrant families crowded into Jacob Riis's tenement photographs, close to unimaginable. Workers who won a labour war not by walking out of the factory at all, but by refusing to leave it. Trace, plainly, the specific and genuinely inventive tactic that finally succeeded, where Homestead and Pullman and Blair Mountain had each in turn failed, at organising mass industrial unionism inside the very heart of American manufacturing, because auto workers at General Motors' own Fisher Body plant in Flint, Michigan, launched in December of 1936 a sit-down strike, occupying the factory itself and physically refusing to leave rather than walking out onto a picket line. The company could simply staff with replacement workers, the way Frick had done at Homestead 4 decades earlier, a tactic that made the strike considerably harder to break, since removing armed strikers from a company's own valuable machinery risked damaging that same machinery in the process, and the strike, organised under the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organisations led by the former coal miner John L. Lewis this evening has already glimpsed at Blair Mountain, held for 44 days through a bitter Michigan winter, workers inside the plant organising their own internal government, their own security patrols, and their own system for receiving food smuggled in by supporters outside, while Michigan's own newly elected governor, Frank Murphy, declined General Motors' own repeated demands that he send in the National Guard to forcibly clear the plant, a restraint that stood in genuinely stark contrast to the state militia deployment this evening, has already described breaking the Homestead strike in 1892. Remember, too, exactly what General Motors finally agreed to once the strike's own 44th day arrived, because the company, facing continued occupation of several of its own most productive plants and mounting financial losses, formally recognised the United Auto Workers as the exclusive bargaining representative for its own production workers in February of 1937, a victory that touched off a wave of similar organising success across the rest of heavy industry. United States Steel, the very corporation Morgan had assembled out of Carnegie's own company, recognising the steelworkers' union without a strike at all, only weeks later specifically to avoid a repeat of the Flint standoff, so that within barely 3 years of the Wagner Act's own passage, American industrial unionism had achieved, through sit-down strikes and the credible threat of more to come, very nearly everything the Amalgamated Association had failed to win at Homestead, and everything the Knights of Labour had failed to win in the Haymarket's own bitter aftermath. A reversal this evening would ask you to hold as the actual hard-won legal and organisational foundation the Treaty of Detroit this evening is about to describe was built directly on top of. A single contract signed in Detroit in 1950 that a national magazine at the time actually nicknamed a treaty, as though 2 sovereign nations rather than one company and one union had just sat down to negotiate peace. Follow plainly the specific labour arrangement that let a considerable share of this same post-war prosperity actually reached the assembly line workers building the cars and appliances driving it, because General Motors and the United Auto Workers, led by a union president named Walter Reuther, negotiated in 1950 a 5-year contract so unusually comprehensive that Fortune magazine dubbed it the Treaty of Detroit, guaranteeing auto workers automatic cost of living wage increases tied to inflation, regular pay increases tied to the plant's own rising productivity, and, for the first time at this kind of scale in American industrial history, employer-funded pension plans and employer-funded health insurance, an arrangement Reuther himself had originally hoped might instead take the form of a broader, government-administered national health and pension system along the lines several European nations were building across these same years, a broader ambition General Motors successfully resisted, offering instead to fund those same benefits privately through the company itself, a choice that brought a full generation of genuine labour peace, and that also, examined honestly from the considerably longer vantage point of the following 70 years, left American retirement security and American health coverage tied, in a way most other wealthy industrialised nations never replicated, directly to a worker's own specific employer, an arrangement that functioned remarkably well for as long as companies like General Motors kept growing, and that left millions of retirees considerably more exposed than they might otherwise have been once. In the following century, some of those same companies eventually did not. Look, too, closely at exactly how completely this same arrangement reshaped what an ordinary American industrial job could actually provide, because a unionised auto worker or steel worker in the 1950s, without any college education and often without having finished high school at all, could reasonably expect for the first time in the whole of the industrial history this evening has described to buy a home, support a family on a single income, and retire with both a pension and employer-provided health coverage. A level of ordinary working-class security that stood in genuinely stark contrast to the 12-hour, 7-day shifts and complete absence of any retirement provision this evening as already described at Carnegie's own Homestead Mill only 2 generations earlier, and that a considerable number of labour historians since have identified as the high watermark of the specific and historically unusual bargain: high wages, real job security, and a large, powerful, densely unionised industrial workforce that the middle third of the 20th century briefly allowed the very same industries this whole evening has spent so long describing exploiting far more ruthlessly in their own earlier decades. What the engine actually sounded like and smelled like and felt like to the people who spent their own working lives standing directly inside it. Before this evening turns toward the several ledges this whole story is left still open, it is worth pausing to reconstruct, as plainly and as physically as the surviving record allows, what it actually meant to live inside the industrial cities this whole engine was built out of, because a Pittsburgh or a Cleveland or a Pittsburgh mill town at the height of the Gilded Age was not, for the overwhelming majority of the people who actually lived there, a triumphant landscape of soaring output figures, but a place where the sky itself, by the testimony of a great many visitors and residents alike, rarely showed its own true colour. Coal smoke from thousands of furnaces and thousands of home hearths, settling so permanently over Pittsburgh's own downtown that streetlights in the city, by multiple contemporary accounts, sometimes had to be lit at midday, where laundry hung outside to dry came back in streaked with soot before it had ever fully dried, and where a steelworker's own home, however modest, generally sat within easy walking distance of a mill whose own furnaces ran, without ever fully pausing, through every hour of every day and every night of the entire year, so that the same orange glow that lit a night sky for miles around a working steel town was, to the families who actually lived beneath it, simply the ordinary and unremarkable colour the horizon happened to be. Sit with, too, the specific and genuinely visceral physical experience of the work itself, because a puddler or a roller working an open hearth furnace stood, for a 12-hour shift, close enough to molten steel that a Bureau of Labour investigator touring American steel mills in the early 1900s recorded ambient temperatures near the furnace mouths exceeding 130 degrees, workers drinking, by some contemporary estimates, well over a gallon of water across a single shift simply to avoid collapsing from the heat, wearing wooden-soled boots specifically because leather would scorch and curl against floors radiating heat up from below, and it is worth naming too the specific sound such a mill actually produced, a continuous bone-deep concussion of steam hammers and rolling mills that workers in the Lowell textile mills this evening has already described developed their own private sign language to communicate over, and that steelworkers in Homestead and Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana, by a great many surviving accounts, simply learned to stop consciously hearing at all after a few months on the job, a permanent ringing loss of hearing accepted across the whole of this story's timeline, as such an ordinary cost of the work that almost no mill before the middle of the 20th century bothered keeping any formal record of it whatsoever, a count that nobody at the time thought worth keeping carefully, and that later historians have had to reconstruct one scattered coroner's report at a time. Mark, plainly and without softening it, exactly how poorly this whole engine actually tracked the human cost of its own operation across the better part of a century, because no federal agency systematically and comprehensively tracked industrial workplace deaths anywhere in the United States until well into the 20th century, so that the actual total number of American workers killed building the railroads, mining the coal, and tending the furnaces, this whole story has described remains to any honest modern historian a number that can only be estimated rather than precisely counted. The best available reconstructions suggesting that American industry killed, through accident alone, something in the range of 35,000 workers a year at the peak of the unregulated Gilded Age, a rate, adjusted for the size of the workforce at the time, several multiples higher than anything a modern industrialized economy would tolerate for even a single year, and it is worth remembering, honestly, that these same bare fatality figures capture only the workers who died outright, and say almost nothing at all about the far larger number who survived a workplace accident permanently maimed, an amputated hand or foot from an unguarded piece of factory machinery, a permanently damaged lung from years of coal dust or furnace smoke, injuries that left a worker unable to continue the only trade he had ever learned, with no workers' compensation system of any kind existing anywhere in the United States before Wisconsin passed the nation's first genuinely comprehensive state compensation law in 1911, the very same year the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire this evening has already described burned, and with most American states not following Wisconsin's own example for another decade or more after that. A federal agency that did not actually exist to systematically count any of this until 1971, a full century after the engine this evening has described, had already been running at genuinely dangerous industrial scale. Watch, briefly, exactly how long it actually took the federal government to build any comprehensive, ongoing system for tracking and preventing workplace death and injury nationally, because Congress did not create the Occupational Safety and Health Administration until 1970. The same broader wave of regulatory reform this evening has already described producing the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was only once that same agency began operating, in 1971, that the United States possessed, for the first time in its own industrial history, a single federal body responsible for setting and enforcing workplace safety standards across every state and every industry at once, a reform that helped cut the rate of fatal American workplace injuries by more than half across the following 4 decades, a genuinely substantial and genuinely measurable improvement that this evening would ask you to weigh honestly against the roughly 100 years stretching from the first Pennsylvania coal mines of the 1840s through Carnegie's own open hearth furnaces to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory floor, across which American industry was largely left to police its own safety standards or decline to entirely on its own. A ledger this whole engine ran directly across mile after mile, without ever asking whose land it was actually crossing. It is worth naming, plainly, and without softening it, exactly whose land the Transcontinental Railroad and the whole enormous westward rail network this evening has already described were actually built across, because the same Pacific Railway Acts that handed the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific enormous federal land grants, something in the range of 200 million acres of public land, granted to railroad companies across the whole of the 19th century, once every subsidized line is counted, treated that same land as though it was simply and uncomplicatedly the federal government's own to give away, when in fact a considerable share of it lay within territory recognized under treaties the United States government had itself signed only years or even months earlier as belonging to the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, and a great many other native nations whose own consent was never meaningfully sought before the surveyor's stakes went in, and it is hard not to notice too the specific and genuinely deliberate way railroad expansion and the deteriorating position of the Plains nations moved forward together rather than merely alongside each other, because the railroad companies themselves actively promoted, and in a considerable number of documented cases directly organized, commercial buffalo hunting expeditions specifically to clear the vast herds that still crossed the rail line's own right of way in numbers large enough to regularly delay trains for hours, a slaughter that reduced a bison population estimated at tens of millions of animals at the century's own start to scarcely a few hundred individuals surviving in the wild by the 1890s, and that General Philip Sheridan, commanding federal troops in the region, endorsed openly and explicitly as a deliberate strategy for starving the Plains nations whose own entire economy and entire way of life depended on the herd's own continued survival into eventual submission and eventual confinement onto a rapidly shrinking network of federal reservations. Notice, too, the specific and genuinely bitter irony sitting at the centre of the whole national mythology of westward railroad expansion, because a golden spike ceremony at Promontory Summit that this evening has already described, celebrated, in the language of the newspapers covering it that day, the final conquest of a continent, language that treated the land the rails now crossed as though it had been empty and unclaimed before the railroad company's own surveyors arrived, when in fact every mile of that same track ran across territory that had been, within living memory of the men laying it, someone else's home, and the railroad this evening has spent so long celebrating as the essential precondition for a unified national market was, for the native nations whose own land and whose own primary source of food it ran directly through, not a triumph of connection at all, but one of the single most consequential instruments of their own dispossession. A ledger this evening would ask you to hold alongside the achievement rather than in place of it, because both are equally and simultaneously true. A second and considerably quieter piece of legislation that finished, over the following half-century, what the railroad land grants had already begun. Way, too, the specific follow-on federal policy that continued shrinking native landholding for decades after the last transcontinental spike had been driven, because Congress passed the Dawes Act in 1887, breaking up communally held reservation land into individual allotments assigned to individual native households, a policy its own congressional sponsors framed publicly as a humanitarian effort to encourage individual land ownership and assimilation into mainstream American agricultural life. But that functioned, in its own actual practical effect, as a mechanism for declaring any reservation land left over after individual allotments had been assigned surplus, and opening that same surplus land to purchase by white settlers, a policy that reduced total native landholding across the United States from something in the range of 138 million acres at the time of the Dawes Act's own passage to under 50 million acres by 1934, when Congress finally reversed the policy, a loss of close to 90 million acres, an area larger than the state of California, transferred out of native hands within less than 5 decades, running in parallel, this evening would ask you to notice, with very nearly the exact same decades this evening has spent describing the railroad network built across the continent's own interior, reaching its own fullest and most profitable extent. Chicago's own stockyards, covering close to a square mile at their own peak, and the specific disassembly process Henry Ford would later study and reverse. Examine briefly one further piece of Chicago's own industrial landscape that connects several threads this evening has already pulled on separately, because the Union Stockyards opened on Christmas Day of 1865 specifically to consolidate the city's own scattered meatpacking operations into a single coordinated facility, grew across the following 4 decades into the largest livestock market and meat processing complex the world had yet seen, receiving, at its own peak, close to 15 million animals a year, connected by rail lines running directly from the same cattle ranches of the Western Plains. This evening has already described the railroad opening to settlement and processed by a workforce, a considerable share of it composed of exactly the recent immigrant labourers this evening, has already described crowding into Chicago's own tenement districts, organised along a continuously moving overhead rail system that disassembled a carcass through a long sequence of small, repeated individual tasks. The same basic principle Henry Ford's own engineers would study directly and then deliberately reverse a half-century later at Highland Park, turning a line built to take something apart into a line built to put something together. A single Chicago industry whose own working conditions Upton Sinclair had already exposed to the whole of the reading public standing, examined honestly as the quiet conceptual ancestor of the moving assembly line this evening, has already described transforming automobile manufacturing entirely. A workforce whose own labour helped build the wealth this whole engine produced, and whose own access to that wealth was, for generations, deliberately and legally denied. Take note, too, of and with the same honesty, exactly how completely black Americans were excluded from the industrial prosperity this whole engine generated across the better part of a century, because the same Reconstruction-era promise of genuine economic inclusion that followed the Civil War this evening has already described collapsed across the 1870s and 1880s into a system of sharecropping and legal segregation across the South that kept the overwhelming majority of formerly enslaved Americans and their own children tied to agricultural labour on terms only marginally better than slavery itself, systematically denied any meaningful access to the industrial wages. This whole story has spent so long describing white immigrant workers, earning in the mills and mines and factories of the industrializing North, and when the Great Migration this evening has already described, did finally carry hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of black Americans into those same northern industrial cities across the first half of the 20th century, they arrived to find themselves steered by a combination of open employer discrimination, exclusionary union policy, and, from the 1930s onward, formal federal housing policy toward the lowest paid and most dangerous industrial positions available, and into a narrow band of segregated urban neighbourhoods that a newly created homeowners loan corporation mapping American cities for mortgage risk beginning in 1935 systematically marked in red ink as too hazardous for federally backed home loans, the practice historians now call redlining, a designation that excluded black families as a matter of explicit and openly documented federal policy from the very same low-interest home loans that let millions of white veterans this evening, as already described, purchase their own suburban tract homes under the GI Bill, so that the 2 decades of post-war prosperity this evening has just finished describing arrived, for a considerable share of black industrial workers, filtered through a set of legal and institutional barriers that kept the wealth their own labour was helping generate concentrated overwhelmingly in white hands, a gap in accumulated family wealth between black and white American households that a great many economists have since traced directly back to this same specific post-war policy window, and that has never, in the 8 decades since, fully closed. Remember too that the GI Bill itself, though written in officially race-neutral language at the federal level, was administered locally, state by state and often bank by bank, in a manner that let black veterans returning from a war this evening as already described them, fighting in segregated units, be routinely denied the same mortgage guarantees and the same college tuition benefits white veterans received almost automatically. A single piece of federal legislation whose own on-paper universality and whose own on-the-ground practice diverged so sharply that a considerable number of historians now treat it as one of the largest single missed opportunities for genuine post-war racial economic equity in the whole of this story. A door that had swung open only because the men who normally filled the factory floor were fighting overseas, and that swung most of the way back shut within about 18 months of their own return home. Look, honestly, closely at exactly what happened to the 6 million women this evening has already described entering American heavy industry for the first time across the Second World War, once that same war actually ended, because female participation in the American manufacturing workforce, which had climbed sharply across the war years, fell by roughly a quarter within a single year of the war's own end in 1945. A great many factories and, in a considerable number of documented cases, the very same unions this evening has already described winning genuine post-war security for their own male members, moving deliberately to prioritise returning veterans for the highest-paying industrial positions, and government-sponsored wartime propaganda that had spent years actively recruiting women into the factories with the rosy. The riveter image this evening has already pivoted within months, to an equally deliberate campaign encouraging women back toward homemaking, and toward the more limited clerical and service positions considered, by the era's own prevailing expectations, more properly feminine. And it is worth naming too the specific and genuinely direct line a considerable number of historians have since drawn between that same post-war reversal and the writer Betty Friedan's own 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, which documented, drawing in part on Friedan's own earlier career as a labour journalist covering exactly this same wartime and post-war workforce shift, a widespread and largely unspoken dissatisfaction among women who had briefly held and then lost the kind of skilled industrial employment and the kind of independent wage this whole story has spent so long describing men receiving as an ordinary and largely unquestioned birthright. A photographer who spent over a decade quietly walking into mills and mines with a hidden camera, specifically to document the children this engine had put to work. It is worth naming, too, exactly how young a considerable share of this whole engine's actual workforce genuinely was for most of the period this evening has been describing, because American industry employed, by the most careful surviving estimates, something in the range of 2 million children under the age of 16 by 1900. Boys as young as 8 or 9 working as breaker boys in Pennsylvania coal country, picking slate and impurities out of raw coal on a moving conveyor for 10 and 12-hour shifts in rooms so thick with coal dust that a considerable number of the boys developed severe respiratory illness before they had even reached their own teenage years, and young girls working alongside their own mothers in textile mills and canneries, small enough in a considerable number of documented cases to be assigned specifically to reach into and clean the moving parts of machinery, too dangerous for an adult worker's larger hands to safely access, and it is worth naming plainly a specific photographer whose own patient documentary work did more than perhaps any other single body of evidence to force this same practice into genuine national public awareness, because Lewis Hine, hired by the National Child Labour Committee beginning in 1908, travelled the country for close to a decade, frequently posing as a Bible salesman, an insurance agent, or an industrial photographer documenting equipment rather than workers, in order to talk his way past mill owners who otherwise refused him entry, and photographed in careful, unposed detail thousands of individual working children, recording each child's own name, age, and specific job in his own accompanying notes whenever he could persuade the child or a nearby adult to tell him. Consider, too, exactly how long it actually took this same documented evidence to translate into any lasting federal protection, because Congress passed the Keating-Owen Child Labour Act in 1916, restricting the interstate shipment of goods produced using child labour, only to watch the Supreme Court strike the law down as an unconstitutional overreach of federal commerce power in 1918, a pattern repeated when a second child labour law, this one built around a federal tax rather than a direct commerce restriction, was struck down by the same court in 1922, so that a constitutional amendment specifically authorising federal child labour regulation, passed by Congress in 1924, was sent to the states for ratification and never actually secured the support of enough state legislatures to take effect at all, leaving American child labour law, for the better part of 2 further decades, a patchwork of inconsistent and frequently unenforced state statutes, and it would not be until the Fair Labour Standards Act of 1938, passed in the considerably more favourable constitutional climate the New Deal had by then established, that Congress finally succeeded in setting a comprehensive federal minimum working age that would actually survive judicial review close to 30 years after Hine's own photographs had first begun putting the reality of American child labour in front of a national audience. A river that caught fire, and the moment the smoke over Pittsburgh finally became something the whole country agreed needed fixing. Notice, too, the specific and considerably longer delayed reckoning this whole engine eventually faced over the physical damage its own 2 centuries of unregulated coal smoke, chemical runoff, and industrial waste had done to the land and the water and the air surrounding it, because the same Cuyahoga River running through industrial Cleveland caught fire, by one careful count, at least 13 separate times between 1868 and 1969, floating industrial oil and debris igniting on the water's own surface, with a regularity so routine across the preceding century that most of the earlier fires had drawn scarcely any national attention at all. and it was only the June 1969 fire, considerably smaller in its own actual physical damage than several of the river's own earlier blazes, but photographed and covered by Time magazine at a moment when a broader national environmental consciousness had already begun to build, that finally became the singular galvanizing symbol a great many historians credit with helping push Congress to create the Environmental Protection Agency the following year and to pass a considerably strengthened Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act across the early 1970s, a regulatory reckoning that arrived, honestly counted, roughly a full century after Pittsburgh's own perpetually blackened midday sky had first become a settled and largely unremarked feature of American industrial life. A century in which the same soot and the same chemical runoff this evening has already asked you to picture had been quietly accumulating in the lungs and the drinking water of the same industrial communities whose own labour had built the engine producing it in the first place. Both hands held open at once on the men this whole story has spent so long following. Trace, before this evening turns toward its own final hours, to hold plainly, and at the same time both the genuine achievement and the genuine cost this whole story has attached, across every single one of its own central figures, to the men who actually built and directed the engine this whole night has been describing, because doing anything less would flatten a genuinely complicated history into a story simpler and less honest than the one the surviving evidence actually supports. Andrew Carnegie built the most productive steel industry the world had yet seen, drove the cost of steel down to a level that made possible the skyscrapers, the bridges and the railroads an entire modernizing civilization depended on, and gave away, by the end of his own life, a larger share of his own personal fortune to public libraries, universities and civic institutions than perhaps any private individual in human history before him, funding some 2,500 public libraries across the English-speaking world, a considerable number of which still stand and still serve their own communities today, and that same Andrew Carnegie also presided, at a considerable physical and emotional remove, over a labour system that worked men 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in conditions that killed and maimed them at a rate his own company's management never seriously moved to reduce until forced to, and personally endorsed, from an ocean away, the strike-breaking campaign at Homestead that set organised labour in the American steel industry back by close to 40 years. Both of these things equally and simultaneously true of the exact same man. Follow too John Pierpont Morgan, who assembled out of Carnegie's own sold company an organisation efficient and stable enough to make American steel production genuinely predictable for the first time in its own history, and who personally, at real financial risk to his own considerable fortune, held the entire American banking system together during the panic of 1907, when no other institution existed to do it, actions that reflected, by most contemporary accounts, a genuine if paternalistic sense of personal responsibility for the stability of the whole national economy. And that same J. Pierpont Morgan structured his own banking house's enormous influence in ways that concentrated an almost unaccountable degree of private power over the nation's own railroads, steel production, and banking system in a small circle of interlocking corporate directorships answerable, in practice, to no elected body at all. A concentration of unelected private authority that the progressive era reforms this evening has already described, the Federal Reserve, the Sherman Antitrust Act's own more vigorous later enforcement, and the eventual Congressional Pujo Committee investigation into what its own members called the Money Trust, were built, in no small part, specifically to check. Mark II John D. Rockefeller, who built through a combination of genuine operational genius and tactics, a federal court would eventually rule illegal, the most efficient and among the cheapest kerosene and later gasoline supply chains the world had yet produced, bringing affordable lighting fuel within reach of ordinary households across the entire country, and, in his own later decades, giving away a fortune that funded the eradication of hookworm disease across the American South, the founding of the University of Chicago, and medical research institutions that remain, over a century later, among the most consequential in the entire world, And that same John D. Rockefeller crushed smaller competitors through secret railroad rebates and predatory pricing deliberately calculated to bankrupt, rather than merely outcompete them, in a pattern of business conduct a unanimous Supreme Court would eventually find so thoroughly in violation of American antitrust law that it ordered his life's own singular achievement broken into 34 separate pieces. And consider finally Henry Ford, who made automobile ownership genuinely available to ordinary working families for the first time in human history, and who paid, in 1914, a wage double the prevailing industry standard, specifically because he had come to believe, with real and consequential insight, that his own workers deserved to share more fully in the wealth their own labour helped create. And that same Henry Ford ran an internal company police force that surveilled and disciplined workers' private lives, with an intrusiveness a great many of his own contemporaries found genuinely disturbing, and spent a considerable share of his own later years and his own considerable fortune funding and personally promoting anti-Semitic propaganda on a scale that drew direct praise from Adolf Hitler himself, a man later personally decorated by the Nazi regime he had, through his own published writing, helped ideologically supply, a fact this evening names plainly rather than politely omitting, because a story this honest about the engine's own human cost owes the same honesty to the men who built it. Voices that never sat for a formal portrait or wrote a memoir, remembered instead through the handful of letters and interviews that happened to survive. From here, the story moves to, before this evening moves toward its own close, to a handful of the ordinary people this whole engine actually ran on, because the industrialists whose names this evening has spent so long tracing, left behind detailed memoirs, published essays, and carefully curated public reputations, while the millions of workers whose own labour actually built the mills and laid the rails and staffed the assembly lines left behind, in the great majority of cases, almost nothing at all beyond a name in a company ledger or a line in a census form. And it is worth naming a few of the fragments that did survive, because a Slovak immigrant steelworker named Mike Kupchik, interviewed decades later as part of an oral history project documenting the Homestead strike, remembered his own father coming home from a double shift so exhausted that he would fall asleep still holding a piece of bread halfway to his own mouth, and a young Italian immigrant garment worker who survived the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a woman named Rose Friedman who lived to be 107 years old and who spent the last years of her own long life giving public testimony, specifically so the fire would not be forgotten, recalled in an interview recorded not long before her death in 1999. The specific and permanent sound of the stairwell door rattling uselessly in its own locked frame as her fellow workers pushed against it, a sound she said she still heard, some 88 years later, whenever she closed her own eyes at night. And it is worth letting these two small fragments of memory stand honestly for the millions of working lives this whole engine consumed and produced in roughly equal measure, lives the official record mostly declined to keep any careful account of at all. One life, standing on a New York sidewalk on a March afternoon in 1911, that traces this whole story's arc from tenement fire to federal law more completely than perhaps any other single biography could. Before this evening moves toward its own final hours, one further individual life carries an unusually large share of everything this whole night has been trying to describe, and it is worth turning to her directly, because a young social worker named Frances Perkins happened to be having tea with a friend near Washington Square on the afternoon of the 25th of March, 1911, when she heard the commotion of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire this evening, as already described, breaking out only blocks away, and ran, along with a considerable crowd of other bystanders, to the scene, arriving in time to personally witness workers jumping from the 9th floor windows rather than burn, a sight she would describe, across the whole of her own considerably longer subsequent career, as the day the New Deal was born, decades before the New Deal itself actually existed as any kind of formal political programme. Watch, too, exactly what Perkins actually did with that same witnessed horror across the following 3 decades, because she joined the New York State Factory Investigating Commission formed in the fire's own immediate aftermath. Working alongside the young legislators Al Smith and Robert Wagner this evening has already named, touring factories across the state to document unsafe conditions firsthand, and Rose across the following 2 decades of steady public service. First to lead New York's own state Labor Department under Governor Franklin Roosevelt, and then, when Roosevelt became president in 1933, to become the first woman ever to serve in a United States presidential cabinet, appointed Secretary of Labor, a position from which she personally drafted and championed a considerable share of the New Deal's own core labor legislation. This evening has already described the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act guaranteeing collective bargaining, and the Fair Labor Standards Act that finally, in 1938, set a national minimum wage and a genuinely enforceable federal minimum working age, closing, at last, the specific unfinished business Lewis Hind's own photographs had first forced into public view some 3 decades earlier. Follow, finally, exactly how directly Perkins's own later legislative career traces back to that single afternoon on a New York sidewalk, because she said so herself, repeatedly and explicitly, across the whole of her own remaining life, telling audiences that she had never been able to walk past the Ash Building, still standing today at the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, without remembering exactly what she had watched happen there, and it is worth letting Perkins's own single working life stand this evening would suggest as the clearest possible answer to a question this whole story has been quietly asking from its very first scene, whether the engine this whole night has described building itself out of steel and oil and immigrant labour was capable of also, eventually, building the legal protections its own workers so plainly needed. An answer this evening would offer honestly as neither a simple yes nor a simple no, but as a considerably slower and considerably more contested process than the engine's own raw production numbers, taken alone, would ever suggest. A fairground built to look like a city carved from marble, and the specific way it measured, without quite meaning to exactly how far this whole engine had actually travelled. Mark II, a considerably lighter but genuinely useful way of measuring this whole transformation across time, because the great world's fairs of this same period offer a kind of recurring stage snapshot of American industrial confidence, not unlike the exhibition halls a companion evening in this same room has already described Germany using to measure its own rise, and the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893, to mark a year late the 400th anniversary of Columbus's own voyage, offered the clearest possible early example. A temporary city of gleaming white neoclassical buildings nicknamed the White City by visitors, and covered, for the first time at any American public event of this scale, in thousands of electric lights powered by Westinghouse's own alternating current system, a decisive and highly public demonstration of exactly the technology this evening has already described Edison trying so hard to discredit only a few years earlier, drawing some 27 million visitors, a number equivalent to close to half the entire population of the United States at the time, and showcasing American industrial and engineering achievement, the fair's own towering Ferris wheel among its most celebrated single attractions, on a scale that a great many European visitors, accustomed to regarding American manufacturing as still fundamentally provincial, compared to Britain's own established industrial prestige, found genuinely startling to witness in person. Picture too how differently a similar fair, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, held in St. Louis in 1904, was received barely a decade later, because by 1904 American industrial exhibits no longer needed to argue for the country's own basic competence at all. The fair's own exhibits showcasing early automobiles, wireless telegraphy, and a scale of electrical illumination that dwarfed even Chicago's own celebrated White City, covered by international observers now discussing American manufacturing not as an intriguing regional curiosity, but as the emerging industrial standard the rest of the world would soon need to measure itself against. A shift in tone across barely 11 years that traces in miniature very nearly the same transformation. This whole evening's own steel output figures and rail mileage figures have already demonstrated in considerably harder numbers. a gap between the richest households and everyone else that grew, across these same decades, wide enough that a considerable share of the era's own contemporaries gave the whole period a deliberately unflattering name. Watch, plainly, exactly how unevenly the enormous new wealth this whole engine generated across the final decades of the 19th century actually distributed itself, because the author Mark Twain and his own co-author Charles Dudley Warner coined, in a satirical 1873 novel, the term the Gilded Age specifically to describe a period they regarded as glittering on its own surface, while concealing underneath that same gleaming veneer real and widening social corrosion and the underlying economic data a great many later historians have since assembled, largely vindicates the satire, the wealthiest 1% of American households controlling something in the range of a quarter of the entire nation's wealth by the 1890s, a concentration the country would not see matched again until the early 21st century, and ordinary industrial wages, even as the overall national economy grew at a genuinely remarkable pace across these same decades, rising for a considerable share of the industrial workforce, barely enough to keep pace with the cost of living in the crowded tenement districts this evening has already described. Consider too the specific and genuinely consequential legal reckoning this same widening gap eventually provoked, because the federal government had relied, for the whole of the 19th century, almost entirely on tariffs and excise taxes for its own revenue, a system that fell, in practical effect, considerably harder on ordinary consumers buying everyday goods than on the enormous fortunes this evening has spent so long describing being accumulated by Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan. And when Congress attempted, in 1894, to pass a modest federal income tax specifically targeting the wealthiest households, the Supreme Court struck it down the following year as unconstitutional, ruling that a direct tax of this kind required apportionment among the states by population, in a way that made any genuinely progressive income tax essentially unworkable, a ruling that stood for close to 2 decades until a progressive-era coalition of reformers finally succeeded. In 1913, the very same year the Federal Reserve this evening has already described was created, in ratifying the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, explicitly authorizing Congress to levy an income tax without apportionment, a single constitutional amendment that would, across the following century, fund an increasingly large share of exactly the kind of federal regulatory and social infrastructure, antitrust enforcement, workplace safety inspection, and eventually Social Security itself this whole evening has already described the engine's own excesses making necessary in the first place. A 36-year-old congressman from Nebraska telling a packed convention hall that humanity would not be crucified upon a cross of gold, and very nearly winning the presidency on that single sentence alone. It is worth naming too the specific political backlash the same industrial transformation this evening has spent so long celebrating provoked among the millions of American farmers who felt, with real and well-documented justification, that they were being left behind by it entirely, because farmers across the Great Plains and the South, squeezed between falling crop prices driven down by the same efficient national rail and grain elevator network this evening, has already described connecting them to distant markets, and the high fixed costs of the railroad freight rates and bank loans that same network depended on, organised, across the 1880s and 1900s, into a genuinely powerful political movement, the populists demanding federal regulation of railroad rates, an expanded currency supply built around silver rather than gold alone to ease their own crushing debt burdens, and a graduated income tax not unlike the one this evening has already described the 16th Amendment eventually delivering. And it was a Nebraska congressman named William Jennings Bryan who carried this same agrarian grievance to the very centre of national politics, delivering, at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, a speech culminating in the declaration that mankind would not be crucified upon a cross of gold, a single sentence so electrifying that the convention hall itself, by multiple contemporary accounts, remained in a state of sustained uproar for close to half an hour afterward, and that one Bryan, at only 36 years old, his own party's presidential nomination on the strength of that single address alone. Examine too exactly how that same election actually turned out, because Bryan lost the general election of 1896 to the Republican William McKinley, whose own campaign, managed by a wealthy Ohio industrialist named Mark Hanna, and funded by exactly the kind of concentrated industrial and financial wealth this evening, has spent the whole night describing, Standard Oil and Carnegie's own steel interests prominent among the contributors, spent several times what Bryan's own campaign could raise. A financial imbalance a great many historians consider one of the first genuinely modern demonstrations of exactly how much industrial wealth could shape the outcome of a national American election once that wealth had actually decided to organise itself politically, and it is worth naming honestly that the underlying grievance behind Bryan's own failed campaign, that the industrial engine this whole evening has described, was distributing its own enormous rewards in a genuinely lopsided way between the financiers and industrialists at its centre and the farmers and labourers at its edges, never actually disappeared after 1896, but carried forward directly into the progressive era reforms this evening has already described and into the New Deal a full generation further on, a losing campaign whose own underlying argument, examined honestly across the following half-century, arguably won considerably more of the country's own eventual policy than its own candidate ever managed to win at the ballot box. How we actually know any of this, and whose own version of events has, across the following century, tended to dominate the telling. Weigh, honestly, exactly where a story spanning a century and a half of American industrial history actually comes from, because the sources this whole evening has drawn on are themselves considerably more contested and considerably more unevenly preserved than a listener drifting through a single unbroken narrative might otherwise assume, and it is worth naming plainly that the industrialists themselves, Carnegie chief among them, left behind extraordinarily detailed and extraordinarily self-flattering autobiographies, Carnegie's own memoir, published only after his death in 1919, presenting a carefully curated account of his own rise that later biographers, cross-referencing his own private correspondence and his own company's internal records, have had to work hard to separate from the considerably messier and considerably less flattering reality, while Rockefeller, by contrast, remained famously guarded and famously reluctant to discuss his own business methods publicly at all across the whole of his own working life, so that a great deal of what is actually known about Standard Oil's own internal operations comes not from Rockefeller's own testimony, but from the congressional and state legislative investigations, the sworn courtroom testimony from the 1888 and later antitrust proceedings, and Ida Tarbell's own painstaking documentary journalism this evening has already described. Sources considerably more adversarial in their own original purpose than a company founder's own memoir, and correspondingly more useful in a great, many historians' own careful judgment for understanding what Standard Oil actually did rather than merely what its own founder wished to be remembered for. Take note too of exactly how much harder it has proven, across the whole of the following century, to recover the actual voices and the actual experiences of the ordinary workers this whole engine depended on, because the overwhelming majority of the immigrant labourers, the mill hands and the mine workers, whose own labour this evening has spent so long describing, left behind no memoirs, no personal papers, and in a great many cases, given the limited literacy and the limited leisure time such punishing working hours actually allowed, no written record of any kind at all, so that historians attempting to reconstruct their own daily experience have had to rely on considerably more indirect sources. The company payroll ledgers and hospital admission records this evening has already described researchers using to partially recover the true toll of Chinese labour on the Transcontinental Railroad. The oral history projects, a great many of them not undertaken until the 1970s and 1980s, when the last living survivors of events like the Homestead Strike and the Triangle Fire were already quite elderly. That preserved voices like Mike Kupchik's and Rose Friedman's this evening has already quoted, and the sociological investigations, Jacob Rees's own photographic documentation chief among them, that a small number of contemporary reformers conducted specifically because they recognised, even at the time, that nobody else was bothering to systematically record what tenement and factory life actually looked like from the inside, and it is worth naming, honestly, that this same imbalance in the surviving record, extensive and self-authored testimony from the men at the top, fragmentary and mostly reconstructed testimony from everyone who actually built what they owned, has shaped, in ways historians are still actively working to correct, which version of this whole story has tended to dominate popular American memory across the century and a half since. Nothing about any of this was ever actually guaranteed to happen, and it is worth sitting honestly with exactly how much of it turned on outcomes nobody at the time could have reliably predicted. Examine too, before this evening turns toward its own recap and its own close, exactly how much genuine contingency, rather than any inevitable national destiny, actually ran through this whole story, because the United States industrialized behind two enormous oceans that spared its own mainland industrial base, the direct bombardment every other major combatant power endured across two separate world wars, a geographic accident of considerable consequence that had nothing whatsoever to do with any particular genius on the part of Carnegie or Rockefeller or Ford, and the specific decades in which tens of millions of immigrants arrived to staff the mills and the mines this evening as described, happened to align, largely by chance rather than by any deliberate American design, with a period of genuine agricultural crisis and political upheaval across large parts of Europe that pushed migration outward at precisely the moment American industry most needed the labour, and the specific mineral deposits, the iron ore of the Mesabi Range, the oil beneath western Pennsylvania and later Texas, the coal seams of Appalachia, that this whole engine ran on simply happened, through no American engineering or American policy at all, to sit beneath American soil in quantities that a great many other industrializing nations of the same period, Japan chief among them, that this evening's own companion stories on other nights have already described struggling for decades against comparatively meagre domestic resources never possessed in anything like the same abundance, so that the story this whole evening has told is, examined honestly, considerably less a story of unique American genius than a story of favourable geography, fortunate timing, and genuine human ambition and genuine human suffering meeting each other at exactly the right historical moment to compound into something considerably larger than any single piece could have produced alone. A retiring five-star general, on his own final night in the White House, warning the country about the very same industrial machine he had spent a world war depending on completely. Take note plainly of the specific and genuinely striking warning a departing president delivered only 3 days before leaving office, because Dwight Eisenhower, who had commanded Allied forces in Europe during the war this evening, has already described and understood, from the most direct possible personal experience, exactly how essential the wartime partnership between the federal government and American industry had been to actually winning it, used his own farewell address on the 17th of January, 1961, to caution the nation against what he called, in the phrase that speech is now remembered for above almost anything else, the military-industrial complex, a permanent and enormous peacetime arms industry that the Cold War, following so closely on the heels of the Second World War this evening has already described, had allowed to take root and to acquire, in Eisenhower's own carefully chosen words, unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, in the councils of government, a warning considerably more remarkable for coming from the same career soldier who had personally directed and depended on that same industrial machine at its own wartime peak than it would have been coming from any career critic of American militarism, and one that named, with a clarity this evening's own listeners can judge for themselves, against everything the night has already described, exactly the same tension between an engine's own genuine necessity and its own genuine danger that had already run through every single decade of this whole story. From Carnegie's furnaces to Ford's bombers to the aerospace contractors this evening will name next. A beeping metal sphere passing overhead, that convinced an entire skeptical Congress, almost overnight, to fund the next version of this same engine. Remember, too, the specific shock that redirected a considerable share of this whole engine's own post-war momentum toward an entirely new frontier, because the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth on the 4th of October, 1957, produced across the following weeks a wave of genuine American public alarm considerably larger than the small aluminum sphere's own actual military significance ever really justified. A fear that a rival superpower had somehow overtaken American technical and industrial supremacy, the very same supremacy this whole evening has spent so long describing being built. And Congress responded within a year by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and by passing the National Defense Education Act, pouring federal money into science and engineering education, and into an entirely new aerospace industry at a scale and a speed that echoed deliberately and explicitly in the language contemporary officials themselves used. The same kind of centrally coordinated wartime mobilization Bernard Baruch and the War Production Board had once directed, a mobilization that would culminate on the 20th of July 1969 in American astronauts landing on the surface of the Moon, a single achievement built, in the most literal sense, out of exactly the kind of enormous coordinated industrial supply chain this whole evening has described running through steel and oil and electricity for the whole of the preceding century. Thousands of separate contractors and subcontractors across the country manufacturing the individual components of a single Saturn V rocket. Remember, too, the specific and genuinely consequential piece of spillover technology this same space-driven federal spending helped bring into being, because the same drive to miniaturize and improve the reliability of the electronic guidance systems, astronauts and missiles alike depended on poured federal research money into the young and still commercially unproven integrated circuit industry, clustering by the 1960s in the same valley south of San Francisco this evening has already named, NASA and the Department of Defense together purchasing, across the technology's own critical early years, a large enough share of total American integrated circuit production to let manufacturers achieve the economies of scale that would eventually make the same technology cheap enough for ordinary commercial and consumer use. A pattern this evening would ask you to notice as one final, quieter echo of everything this whole night has already described, a federal government stepping in, exactly as it had with the Pacific Railway Acts and the Rural Electrification Administration and the Manhattan Project before it, to fund and de-risk exactly the kind of enormous, uncertain, long-horizon infrastructure investment that private capital, alone, left entirely to its own devices, had generally proven reluctant to make first. A mill town that once ran 3 shifts a day, and the specific present-day quiet that now sits where the furnace glow used to be. Look, honestly, closely at exactly what happened to a considerable share of this whole engine once the singular post-war advantage this evening has already described, an intact American industrial base facing bombed-out and rebuilding rivals, gradually and inevitably narrowed across the following decades, because West Germany and Japan both rebuilt across the 1950s and 1960s with genuinely modern post-war factories, in several respects considerably more technologically current than America's own comparatively aging industrial plant, began by the 1970s competing directly and often successfully against American steel and American automobiles. In markets the United States had once dominated almost without serious challenge, and American steel production, which had stood at close to half the entire world's total output in the immediate post-war years, fell to a considerably smaller share across the following decades as former rivals rebuilt and as entirely new competitors, South Korea and eventually China chief among them, industrialized in turn using a great many of the exact same techniques, protective tariffs, government-subsidized infrastructure, and a large mobile workforce willing to work for wages considerably below the American industrial standard. That this whole evening has already described the United States itself, using against Britain a full century earlier, so that the same Pittsburgh whose own perpetually blackened sky this evening has already described, watched its own steel employment collapse across the 1970s and 1980s, mills that had once run 3 full shifts a day, every day of the year, closing outright, and towns across what a national vocabulary that emerged across these same decades came to call the Rust Belt, from Youngstown to Gary to Detroit itself, absorbing a wave of job loss and population decline from which a considerable number of them have, honestly, never fully recovered. Look too closely at exactly what has actually replaced the specific kind of heavy industrial engine this whole evening has spent so long describing, because American economic dominance across the following half-century has continued in ways this evening would ask you to notice without pretending the story simply repeats itself unchanged, but has continued increasingly through different and considerably less visibly smoke-belching channels. The same federal research investment that built the Manhattan Project and funded the post-war aerospace industry, seeding across the 1950s and 60s, the university and defense contractor research networks around Stanford and around Boston's own Route 128 corridor that would eventually grow into the semiconductor and software industries clustering, by the 1980s, around a valley south of San Francisco that had, only a few decades earlier, been known primarily for its own orchards, an industry built not around steel furnaces or assembly lines but around silicon, software and venture capital, yet resting, examined honestly, on very nearly the same underlying pattern. This whole evening has traced across a full century and a half patient government investment, waves of immigrant talent drawn by opportunity unavailable at home, and a domestic market large and wealthy enough to reward genuinely new technology at a scale few other nations on earth could match, so that the specific machinery driving American economic primacy has changed considerably more than the underlying engine of geography, immigration, and public investment actually has. Let us walk back, before this evening finally lets you rest, through the whole of the long road that carried a marginal agricultural republic to the largest industrial economy the world had ever seen. It began, this evening has told you, not with any single dramatic invention, but with an unpaid argument, Alexander Hamilton's own vision of an America that made its own manufactured goods rather than merely buying them. A vision Congress mostly ignored until a British wartime blockade during the War of 1812 forced the issue by accident, and it grew, across the following decades, through the patient, unglamorous work of connection, the Erie Canal's own 400 miles of hand-dug ditch, collapsing the cost and the time of moving goods across a continent that friction had previously kept fragmented, and the railroad that so quickly rendered the canal boom obsolete, 30 miles of track in 1830 growing to 30,000 by the eve of a civil war that would, in turn, reveal exactly how completely northern industrial capacity outmatched a southern economy built on cotton and enslaved labour, a war whose own Congress, freed of the southern votes that had blocked Hamilton's programme for 7 decades, finally passed the tariffs and the land grants and the transcontinental railroad charters that let the post-war engine run at a scale no single pre-war decade could have managed. That same engine, this evening has told you, was then built out, piece by enormous piece, by men whose own names became bywords for a particular and genuinely double-edged kind of American ambition. Andrew Carnegie learning, as a bobbin boy and a telegraph operator, the granular cost accounting that let him drive steel production from 77,000 tons in 1870 to tens of millions of tons within a single working lifetime, while presiding, at the very same time, over the 12-hour shifts and the broken Homestead strike that set organised steel labour back for a generation, John D. Rockefeller applying that same relentless efficiency to oil, building Standard Oil into a monopoly so complete that a federal court finally ordered it broken into 34 pieces, and J. Pierpont Morgan assembling, out of Carnegie's own sold company, the first corporation in human history worth a full $1 billion, and then, 5 years later, personally propping up the entire national banking system out of his own pocket during the panic of 1907, because no institution yet existed to do it for him, an absence Congress finally corrected with the Federal Reserve. Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla, meanwhile, fought their own current war over which form of electricity would actually power the factories this whole engine depended on. A rivalry settled decisively at Niagara Falls and completed decades later only when the federal government's own Rural Electrification Administration finally carried power out to the 90% of American farms private companies had judged not worth the wire. None of this evening has told you plainly and would ask you to remember honestly, ran on the ambition of a handful of famous men alone, because it ran, in the most literal and physical sense, on the bodies of the roughly 20 million immigrants who crossed an ocean between 1880 and 1924, processed through Ellis Island's own crowded halls and packed into the dumbbell tenements Jacob Riis photographed, on the Chinese labourers who blasted the Central Pacific's own tunnels through the Sierra Nevada for wages and conditions their own company nearly erased from the historical record entirely, on the roughly 2 million children Lewis Hines spent a decade quietly photographing in mills and mines before Francis Perkins and the New Deal finally closed the legal gap that let them work there in the first place, and on the 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, who burned or jumped to their deaths at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory because a locked stairwell door mattered more to their employers than an escape route did. A single afternoon that a young witness named Frances Perkins carried, by her own account, into every piece of federal labour law she would go on to help write across the following 3 decades. It ran, too, on land taken from native nations whose own treaties the same federal government that signed them broke to make way for the railroad land grants this evening has already described, and on the systematic exclusion of black Americans from the industrial wages and the federally guaranteed home loans that let a great many white immigrant families climb within 2 or 3 working generations from tenement to suburb, and it ran, in the end, at a scale no other nation could match, precisely because 2 world wars gave the engine the one thing patient decades of railroad building and steel consolidation could never have supplied on their own. An urgent, overwhelming, unignorable reason to prove exactly how fast it could actually move. Bernard Baruch's War Industries Board converting an entire national economy to war production in 1917, and Henry Ford's Willow Run plant, Henry Kaiser's welded Liberty ships, 6 million newly employed women, and the physicists of the Manhattan Project doing the same thing at a scale 25 years later that left the United States, when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, holding something in the range of half the entire planet's manufacturing output, a share of global industry no single nation had ever held before, and that no single nation has matched again since, an advantage the country spent deliberately and not merely accidentally, building into the Bretton Woods monetary system, the Marshall Plan, and a domestic highway network that let the following decade's own median household income roughly double. If there is a single image this whole night would ask you to actually carry with you towards sleep, let it be the one this evening opened on. A Scottish weaver's son standing in the mud above a river, carrying a number folded in his own coat pocket because the engine he was helping build that morning was never in the end any single man's creation, and it was never in the end finished, only handed forward, decade after decade, from canal diggers to railroad crews to steel workers, to immigrant garment workers, to the women who riveted bombers together at Willow Run, each of them adding some small piece to a machine that grew, across a century and a half, far larger than anyone standing at its own beginning could possibly have imagined. And that is still, in forms this evening's own listeners carry in their pockets and plug in beside their own beds tonight, quietly running. There was Francis Cabot Lowell, who carried an entire textile mill home from England inside his own memory, because the law would not let him carry it home on paper. There was the tanner William Dawes and the doctor Samuel Prescott. Riding Road's history mostly remembers through a single more famous name, and there were the young women of Lowell's own boarding houses, spinning by day and organising their own first strikes by night. There was DeWitt Clinton funding a ditch his own critics called folly, and the Irish labourers who dug it, and the roughly 12,000 Chinese workers who blasted a railroad through granite. The Central Pacific's own official photographs mostly forgot to include them in. There was Jay Cook, teaching an entire nation how to buy its own war bonds in small enough pieces that ordinary households could actually afford them. And there was Ida Tarbell, spending 5 years of her own working life making sure a monopoly built partly on her own father's ruin would not go unrecorded. There was Lewis Hine, talking his way past foremen with a hidden camera to photograph children the country had otherwise decided not to look at too closely. And there was Francis Perkins, watching from a Washington Square sidewalk and spending the following 3 decades making sure the country finally did. There was Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before he built 2,700 of them. And there was Rose Friedman, carrying the sound of a locked door for 88 years specifically, so the rest of us would not have to guess what it sounded like. And there were the millions of others this whole night could not possibly name individually. The puddlers, and the breaker boys, and the seamstresses, and the riveters, whose own labour is the actual substance of every figure this evening has read aloud tonight, credited, if credited at all, only in the aggregate. That brings us to the end of tonight's long story, though this particular engine, unlike so many of the finished closed stories this channel has told on other nights, never actually finished running at all, because the same tension this whole evening has traced between astonishing collective achievement and unevenly distributed cost is, examined honestly, still turning over somewhere close to you tonight, in a warehouse where a worker's own movements are timed the way Ford's own engineers once timed the Model T's assembly, in a factory town on the far side of the world now doing the same labour Pittsburgh once did, in a river or a stretch of coastline somewhere still absorbing runoff nobody has yet been made to fully account for, and in a great many ordinary households whose own quiet, decent prosperity, however hard-won and however genuinely deserved, still rests, if you trace the wiring back far enough, on the very same century and a half this evening has just walked you through. There is no need to resolve that tension before you sleep tonight, because it has never fully resolved itself in 150 years of trying, and a single quiet hour before dawn was never going to be the hour that finally settled it. If you found some company in this long, unhurried hour, you know by now what would help this small channel most: sticking around, leaving a little of your own evening behind in the comments, and letting this quiet room find its own slow way, one listener at a time from where it sits tonight toward the 10,000 it is still reaching for. Wherever you're hearing this, on YouTube with the Spotify link waiting in the description below, or already on Spotify with Historian at Midnight only a search away, thank you for spending this particular stretch of your own night here. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the furnace glow this whole evening has described fade, quietly, into whatever ordinary dark is actually sitting in your own room tonight. Whatever engine you happen to be a small moving part of, tomorrow can have it back. Tonight it can simply keep running on its own, somewhere far away while you rest. Good night and sweet dreams.